Section 1. The show that started everything. There is a very specific kind of grief that comes not from losing something all at once, but from watching it slip away so slowly that you barely noticed it happening, until one day you looked up and realized it was already gone. That kind of grief has a particular weight to it. It sits differently in your chest than the sharp kind does. It is quieter, it lingers. And if you grew up watching Family Guy, if you were there from the very beginning, or even if you discovered those early seasons later on a lazy afternoon with nowhere to be, then you probably know exactly what that feeling is. Because Family Guy, at its very best, was something worth grieving. That is not an insult. That is actually the highest compliment you can pay a piece of art. You can only grieve something that mattered to you in the first place. And this show in its early life mattered. It was funny in a way that felt genuinely new. It was strange in a way that felt deliberate rather than random. It had characters that were flawed and ridiculous, and yet somehow, in the strange alchemy that only the best writers can pull off, also felt real. Felt like people you might actually know. Felt like a family in all of its messy and imperfect and loudly dysfunctional glory. So, tonight, or this morning, or whatever quiet hour you have found your way to this video, we are going to do something a little different. We are not going to rush through this. We are not going to skim the surface and move on. We are going to settle in and we are going to go through every single promise that this show made to its audience, one by one, character by character, story by story. And we're going to talk about what those promises were, what they felt like when they were being made, and what it felt like when each one of them was quietly broken. This is a story about potential, about what a show can be when the right people care about it enough, and about what happens when that care starts to fade. Let us start at the very beginning, which is the only honest place to start. January 31st, 1999. Super Bowl Sunday in the United States. Tens of millions of people had their televisions on, the way they always do on that particular night in late January. And when the game ended and the screen transitioned into something new, a lot of those people stayed where they were. They had no particular reason to. They just did. And what they saw was a cartoon family in a fictional town somewhere in Rhode Island. A big guy with a round face and glasses. A red haired woman who seemed to be the only one in the house, operating with any kind of common sense. A teenage girl who wanted nothing more than to fit in and couldn't quite manage it. A chubby, awkward boy who looked exactly like his father and had roughly the same amount of self awareness. A baby in a yellow shirt who spoke like a Bond villain and may or may not have been plotting the destruction of all life as we know it. And a dog. A dog who walked on two legs, drove a car, and had read more books than most people you have ever met. 22 million people watched that first episode air. That is not a small number. That is not a lucky fluke or a statistical accident. That is a show arriving and announcing itself to the world in the loudest possible way. The show debuted to 22 million viewers and immediately generated controversy regarding its adult content, as Wikipedia notes, which tells you two things simultaneously. It was seen by a massive audience and it had an immediate personality. It was not polite. It was not careful. It did not arrive quietly, hoping not to disturb anyone. It arrived the way Seth MacFarlane himself would arrive anywhere, with a hat tip, a musical number ready to go, and a room full of jokes he could not wait to tell. Seth MacFarlane was 25 years old when Family Guy premiered. 25. He had studied animation at the Rhode Island School of Design, where he created a thesis film called The Life of Larry, which his professor submitted to Hanna-Barbera. That submission led to Ibarra, and that job led to more work. And the characters he developed in those early shorts, a middle-aged man named Larry and his intellectual dog named Steve, slowly evolved into Peter and Brian Griffin. He pitched a 15-minute pilot to Fox in May of 1998, and the network gave him a budget of $50,000 to make it. He spent about 6 months with no sleep and no life, drawing in his kitchen, doing the pilot. Those are his own words. The passion behind those early days was not manufactured. It was not corporate. It was a young man who had something he needed to make and poured every hour he had into making it. The writing staff for that first season was assembled with care. Chris Sheridan, Danny Smith, Gary Janetti, Ricky Blitt, Neil Goldman, Garrett Donovan, Matt Weitzman, and Mike Barker. These were not writers collected at random. MacFarlane was deeply involved in every stage of the creative process. He was not just lending his voice and cashing checks. He was in the room. He had opinions about the jokes. He had opinions about the characters. He had opinions about what the show should feel like, what it should say, and where its heart should be. When you watch those early episodes now, you can feel that presence. There is a specific voice guiding everything, a point of view, a sensibility that runs through every line of dialogue and every quiet moment and every strange, unexpected choice. And those early episodes made promises. Not the kind of promises you write down or sign your name to, the kind that a piece of art makes simply by existing. When you invest time in a show and you learn who the characters are and what they want and what they are afraid of, the show is making you a promise. It is saying these people matter. What happens to them matters. Come back next week because we have something worth showing you. That is the promise a story makes when it is working. And in those first 3 seasons of Family Guy, that promise felt solid. It felt like something you could lean on. The town the show was set in was a fictional place in Rhode Island. The house the Griffins lived in was an ordinary suburban house on a street full of neighbors. Ordinary, that is, except for the fact that the dog could speak and the baby was quietly constructing devices capable of altering the gravitational pull of the moon. But even those extraordinary elements were grounded in something human. The comedy came from contrast. Brian was intelligent because Peter was not. Stewie was sophisticated because the world around him was so relentlessly simple. Meg was ordinary because everyone else in the household was profoundly and spectacularly not. The humor in those early seasons had layers to it. There were cutaway gags. Yes, the show was already using them in that very first episode, but they were short and sharp and felt like bonuses rather than replacements. The story could carry itself. The characters could carry themselves. An episode in season 1 would begin with a problem, develop that problem through actual interaction between the characters, and resolve in a way that usually said something small but real about who these people were and what they meant to each other. Peter would do something reckless and foolish, the way Peter always did. And by the end of the episode, he would have learned something about the limits of his own recklessness. And you would see in his face and hear in his voice the genuine warmth he felt for the people he had accidentally endangered. That warmth. That is what the earliest promise was built on. The Griffins were not a family who hated each other. They were a family who loved each other awkwardly and imperfectly, and sometimes with catastrophically bad timing. Peter and Lois had a marriage that felt real, which is a strange thing to say about an animated cartoon, but it was true. They bickered. They disagreed. They drove each other to the edge on a fairly regular basis. But there was a current of genuine affection running underneath all of it. A current that surfaced in little moments, a look, a touch, a line of dialogue where the joke and the tenderness arrived at exactly the same time. The first season only had 7 episodes, making it the shortest season to date. Those 7 episodes were enough to establish something. Not just a style, not just a set of recurring jokes, but a foundation. A sense of who these people were and why you might want to spend time with them. At the end of that first season, the show ranked number 33 in the Nielsen ratings with 12.8 million households tuning in. For a brand new animated comedy on a broadcast network, those were serious numbers. The audience was finding it, and the audience was staying. And then Fox, being Fox, made a series of scheduling decisions that read in hindsight like a deliberate attempt to destroy the thing they had just built. During the second season, Family Guy was moved to Thursday nights at 9 in the evening, which placed it in direct competition with Frasier on NBC, one of the most popular comedies on television at the time. The ratings dropped. Fox then moved it to Tuesday nights, where it consistently lost to Who Wants to Be a Millionaire on ABC. The show was shuffled around so many times and with so little notice that the audience had genuine trouble keeping up with where to find it. By the end of the third season in 2002, Fox canceled Family Guy. The show was gone. But here's the thing about a show with a real heart. It does not disappear just because a network stops broadcasting it. The audience that had connected with those first 3 seasons did not forget about it. They did not move on immediately and file the show away under fond memories from the early part of the decade. They held on to it. They bought the DVDs when they came out. They watched the reruns when Cartoon Network picked them up for the Adult Swim block in April of 2003. And those reruns did something that almost never happens in the history of television. They turned a canceled show into a phenomenon. The Adult Swim reruns boosted the network's viewership by 239%. The DVD sets for the first and second seasons sold over 400,000 copies. People were not just watching, they were recommending. They were evangelizing. They were pressing copies into the hands of their friends and saying, "You have to see this. Trust me, just watch the first episode." The cult following that built up around Family Guy during those 3 years it was off the air was something remarkable. It was loyalty earned by quality, and it was the kind of loyalty that could not be manufactured or marketed into existence. It had to be deserved. Fox noticed. Of course, Fox noticed. And in 2004, the network made the decision to order new episodes and bring the show back for a fourth season. What followed was one of the most talked about revivals in the history of American television. A show that had been canceled not once but twice was coming back. The fans celebrated. The internet lit up. It felt like justice. Like the audience had spoken so clearly that even a network famous for poor decisions had been forced to listen. All of that excitement, all of that joy and anticipation was built entirely on the foundation that those first 3 seasons had laid. The promise those seasons had made was so compelling that people spent 3 years keeping it alive until it could be fulfilled again. That is what great storytelling does. That is what real characters do. They stay with you. They earn a permanent place in some part of your mind where the things you love live. This video is about what came next, about the gap between what those early seasons promised and what the later seasons delivered. About every character who started with potential and somewhere along the way lost the thread of who they were supposed to be. About every storyline that pointed towards something meaningful and then quietly retreated before it could arrive. About every joke that began with cleverness and ended with laziness. About every moment when the show could have chosen to be better and chose instead to coast. But mostly, this video is for the people who remember what it felt like to watch those first 3 seasons. Who remember the specific joy of a show that was doing something you had not quite seen before? Who remember the promise? Because you have to know what was promised before you can understand what was lost. There is something worth pausing on in the story of Family Guy's cancellations and revival. Because that story is not just trivia. It is actually central to understanding why the show changed, and changed in the specific ways it changed when it came back. The 3 years between the end of Season 3 and the beginning of Season 4 were not neutral time. They were not a pause between chapters where everything stayed in place while the audience waited. The writing staff dispersed. The writers who had been in that original room, who had developed the tone and the voice and the sensibility that made those first three seasons feel like they came from a single coherent intelligence, went and worked on other shows. They found other jobs. They developed other relationships with other creative visions. MacFarlane himself acknowledged this directly. One effect of the show constantly being pulled off the air was that they were always having to restaff writers. Think about what that means in practice. A writer's room is not just a collection of talented people, it is a culture, a shared understanding built over months and years of shared work, of what the show is and is not, of the difference between a joke that is Family Guy and a joke that is not, of where the characters' edges are and what lives beyond those edges. That shared understanding takes time to build and it cannot be transferred on a document. It lives in people, in conversations, in the hundred small decisions that get made every week in a working writer's room. When the room disperses, the culture disperses with it. When Family Guy came back in 2005, it did not come back with the same room it had left with in 2002. Some of the original writers returned. Others did not, or returned only partially. New writers came in who were talented but who had to build their relationship with the show's sensibility rather than having already lived it for three seasons. That is not a criticism of anyone involved. It is just the reality of what happens when a creative project is interrupted for 3 years and then asked to resume. MacFarlane himself was already a different person at 31 than he had been at 25. Not worse, not better, just different. He had lived through the cancellation. He had watched something he had made with enormous effort and passion be declared not worth continuing, and then vindicated by an audience that refused to let it go, and then given a second chance that most canceled shows never receive. That experience changes a person. It changes what feels important and what feels fragile and what feels expendable. And some of those changes found their way into the show, whether anyone intended them to or not. The fourth season premiered on May 1st. 2005 placed by Fox in the center of their Sunday night animation lineup alongside The Simpsons, King of the Hill, and a brand new show from MacFarlane called American Dad. The hype was real. The ratings were real. The audience that had built up through Adult Swim reruns and DVD sales showed up in real numbers for the premiere. Everything looked like a success story. Everything looked like a show being given the platform it had always deserved. But the show that came back was not quite the same show. The animation looked different, cleaner and stiffer than the looser, more hand-drawn quality of the pre-cancellation seasons. The writing was different in ways that were harder to articulate immediately but became clearer over time. The balance between story and supplementary comedy, between the plot and the cutaway, had shifted. The characters had the same names and faces but were beginning a slow drift away from the specific qualities that had made them work. None of this was obvious in the first episode of the fourth season. The show was still doing most of the things it had always done, still generating genuine laughs, still demonstrating the wit and the strange invention that had earned it its second chance. The cracks were small. They would grow. But in May of 2005, watching the premiere with all that excitement and relief, you would not have been able to see what was coming. You would have just been glad it was back. That gladness was the promise receiving its first test. And for a while, through seasons 4 and 5 and into 6, it passed the test often enough that the overall structure held. The show was still good, if not as good as it had been. The characters were changing, but not yet beyond recognition. The cutaways were expanding, but not yet consuming the whole episode. The warmth was cooling, but not yet gone. This is the part of the story that makes the later decline feel particularly pointed. It was not a sudden collapse. It was a gradual one. The kind you keep explaining away until one day, the accumulation of explanations becomes impossible to sustain. That is the particular shape of this kind of disappointment. Not a betrayal that announces itself, but a series of small retreats that only look like a pattern from a distance. We are just getting started. There's a lot of ground to cover, and we are going to take our time with all of it. Drop a comment below telling me where you are watching from and what time it is wherever you are right now. It always means something to me to know that somebody somewhere is settling in for a long listen. And while you are down there, if this channel is something you have found yourself coming back to, a subscription would mean everything to the growth of this little community we are building together. Section 2. The Promise of Peter Griffin. Let us talk about Peter Griffin. Let us talk about what he was before we get to what he became, because the distance between those two things is one of the most instructive and most heartbreaking journeys in the history of animated television. Understanding what Peter was supposed to be is not just an exercise in nostalgia. It is essential to understanding why everything that came after hurt so much. In the first 3 seasons of Family Guy, Peter Griffin was a specific kind of character. He was not simply the stupid father. That description fits, technically, but it misses everything that made the character work. Peter was the stupid father who genuinely, deeply, imperfectly loved his family. The stupidity was not the point. The love was the point. The stupidity was just the operating system that made every single expression of that love go sideways in the most spectacular possible way. Think about what that means for a comedy. A character who wants to do right by the people he loves, but consistently, inevitably, sometimes catastrophically, fails to do so because his judgment is genuinely terrible and his impulse control is essentially non-existent. That is not just a setup for jokes. That is a character with genuine dramatic potential, because you root for him. Even when he is making the worst possible decision, even when you can see from 3 scenes away exactly how this is going to end badly, you root for Peter Griffin in those early seasons, because you know that underneath the chaos and the noise and the bottomless capacity for self-sabotage, he is trying. In those early seasons, Peter worked at the happy-go-lucky toy factory before losing that job when his boss, Mr. Weed, choked on a dinner roll in the 3rd season episode, Mr. Saturday Night. He later found work at the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery, which became one of the show's more consistent settings. He drank beer with his friends at the Drunken Clam. He loved television and movies, especially things from the 70s and 80s. And his references to pop culture were specific enough to feel like they came from a real person who had spent a lot of time on a couch in front of a television set rather than from a writer's room plugging in jokes. He was overweight and largely unbothered by this fact. He had strong opinions about things he knew very little about and almost no awareness that this was problematic. But here's the thing about that early Peter. When an episode ended badly for his family because of something he had done, there was a reckoning. It was never a complete reckoning. Peter was not the kind of man who underwent sweeping personal transformations over the course of a 22-minute episode and remained transformed by the beginning of the next one. That would have been dishonest, and the early seasons of Family Guy were surprisingly honest about the limits of human change. But there was always a moment, a look on his face, a line of dialogue where the joke arrived at the same time as the genuine feeling, a hug or an apology or a quiet acknowledgement that he had messed up and that the people he had messed things up for actually mattered to him. In the episode A Hero Sits Next Door from the 1st season, Peter becomes jealous of Joe Swanson, his new neighbor who has moved in next door. Joe is a police officer, athletic and respected by the community, despite being a wheelchair user, and Peter spends the episode trying to prove that he is just as impressive, ultimately endangering himself and others in the process. But the resolution of that episode is not Peter triumphant. It is Peter understanding something small about the difference between wanting admiration and deserving it. That is a real lesson, a human one, the kind that lands differently when it is coming from a character you believe in. In From Method to Madness. From the third season, Peter becomes a model after a discovery at the grocery store. The episode is fundamentally silly, the way early Family Guy always was. But it is also about Peter learning that what his family thinks of him matters more than what strangers think of him. Not stated directly, not underlined 3 times, just present in the way the story resolves, in the way Peter and Lois look at each other in the final moments, in the way the joke and the tenderness arrive together. That is what made early Peter work. He was a character in whom the comedy and the humanity were inseparable. You could not extract the warmth from him and leave the funny behind. They came as a package. Strip the warmth out, and what you have left is not a comedy. It is something uglier and less comfortable to watch. But that is exactly what happened. The transformation of Peter Griffin from lovable, dim-witted, but essentially decent father into something far less comfortable to spend time with did not happen overnight. It was gradual. The kind of slow creep that you can only fully see when you step back and look at the whole arc. In season 4, when the show came back from cancellation, his stupidity was pushed slightly further than it had been. Small moments where his reactions seemed less grounded in a real person's psychology and more in the logic of exaggeration for its own sake. By season 5 and 6, the pattern was becoming clearer. By season 8 and beyond, it had completed itself into something almost unrecognizable. The Peter Griffin of the later seasons is not making bad decisions because his judgment is poor. He is making bad decisions in the specific way that characters make bad decisions when the writers no longer care about whether those decisions make internal sense. He is cruel without the underlying warmth that once made the cruelty readable as something other than cruelty. He abandons Lois to what he believes is a shark attack by shoving her under the water and fleeing in a boat. He steals candy from his own baby. He nearly destroys his friend Joe's marriage by encouraging infidelity. He does these things, and the show does not hold him to account for them in any meaningful way, because accounting would require the episode to be about something beyond the immediate moment. And the later seasons increasingly lost the ability to be about anything beyond the immediate moment. The most telling example is the season 10 episode Seahorse Seashell Party, which is discussed more fully in the section about Meg, but which is worth touching on here because of how it frames Peter specifically. In that episode, Meg finally confronts her father about the ways he has treated her. She is specific. She is detailed. She names actual behaviors. And Peter's response is to laugh. Not a guilty laugh. Not a laugh that contains any recognition of having been caught or called out. A genuine laugh of amusement, as though his daughter's pain is a comedy routine he is watching for the first time. The early Peter would not have responded that way. The early Peter might have laughed initially the way someone does when they are uncomfortable and do not know what else to do, but the feeling underneath would have been visible. A recognition. A small but real acknowledgement that something had landed. The later Peter has no such recognition available to him because the writers had slowly removed the infrastructure of his character that made it possible. They took away the love that used to underpin the stupidity. And without the love, the stupidity is just cruelty wearing a baseball cap. There's a specific television term that gets used to describe this kind of character collapse: Flanderization. The word comes from Ned Flanders on The Simpsons, a character who began as a kind, multi-dimensional, warmly religious neighbor, and over time was reduced to nothing but his religiosity, his other traits stripped away season by season until only the most exaggerated version of one quality remained. Family Guy took that process and applied it to every character in its ensemble, but no one suffered more completely than Peter. The things that made Peter Griffin lovable were not accidental. They were not incidental decoration on the edges of a character whose real function was to be stupid and cause trouble. The love and the warmth and the specific working class decency were load bearing walls. They held up everything else. Without them, the house is not the same house. It looks similar from the outside. The shape is familiar, but the inside is different in ways that become clear the longer you spend time in it. There is also the question of consistency, which the later seasons of Family Guy had serious problems with. In those early seasons, Peter was consistent in a way that felt real. He was dumb in the same ways from episode to episode. He loved his family in the same ways. His friendships felt stable and grounded. Joe and Cleveland and Quagmire were not just props to be used when needed and set aside when not. They were part of Peter's world, and the world felt coherent because of it. But as the seasons progressed, Peter became increasingly inconsistent in ways that felt less like natural character complexity and more like whatever the episode required him to be this week. In one episode, he would show a flash of something that resembled the early Peter, something gentle or vulnerable or genuinely funny in the way that required him to be a real person rather than a cartoonish force of destruction. And then the very next episode, he would be doing something so extreme and so unconnected to any version of a human inner life that the earlier moment might as well have never happened. The show seemed aware of this, at least occasionally. There were episodes in the later seasons that appeared to attempt some kind of course correction. Peter's Sister, which aired in the 14th season, tried to explain the origins of his cruelty toward Meg by revealing a history of abuse in his own childhood. It was a genuinely thoughtful episode. The writing in it was sharper than the surrounding season. For approximately 22 minutes, it felt like Family Guy was trying to be the show it used to be. And then it forgot. The next episode returned to business as usual, with whatever small growth Peter had demonstrated in that previous installment, evaporated as completely as morning dew on a warm sidewalk. This was, by the later seasons of Family Guy, the established rhythm. The show would occasionally reach towards something real and then pull back before it could arrive, as if afraid of what might happen if it allowed a character to actually develop rather than simply recycle. Peter's relationships with his friends deteriorated in ways that mirrored the larger erosion of his character. In the very first season, when Joe Swanson moved in next door, Peter was jealous of him. Genuinely, recognizably jealous. In the way that people are jealous of those who seem to have figured something out that they themselves have not. That jealousy was the basis of a real dynamic, one that developed over the following seasons into a genuine friendship between two very different men who liked each other despite, or perhaps because of, their differences. The Peter of the later seasons would do things to Joe that the early Peter would never have contemplated. He would undermine him. He would mock his disability in ways the early show had carefully avoided making the center of any comedy between them. In the episode Internal Affairs, he nearly destroyed Joe's marriage by convincing him to pursue an affair. This was not a mistake born of poor judgment in the specific Peter Griffin tradition, where he does the wrong thing because he genuinely does not think clearly enough to foresee the consequences. This was a choice made with some awareness of what it would do to his friend's life, and it was made anyway. That is not the Peter of seasons 1 through 3. That is a different character wearing Peter's face. The physical violence also took on a different quality in the later seasons. Family Guy always had physical comedy, always had Peter bumping into things and falling down and getting into absurd altercations. The show's long-running bit about Peter's feud with the giant chicken, who first appeared in the second season in Boom when he gave Peter an expired coupon, was one of the great sustained visual gags in animated television. These enormous, elaborately choreographed battles between a man and a chicken that escalated to increasingly cinematic levels with each new installment. Those fights were funny because they were clearly a cartoon, clearly operating by cartoon logic, clearly a stylized exaggeration of physicality rather than anything resembling actual violence. The violence in the later seasons was different. It was more specific, more graphic, less clearly operating on cartoon logic, and more clearly in the territory of simulated harm. Characters were depicted with injuries that went beyond what standard animated slapstick required. The graphic nature of some of these moments seemed designed not to generate laughs, but to generate reactions, which is a different thing. Shock is not comedy. It can precede comedy, it can accompany comedy, but it is not comedy itself, and that the later seasons of Family Guy confuse the two with increasing frequency. The most revealing character test for later seasons Peter is how he treats moments of vulnerability, not his own, which he never acknowledged, but the vulnerability of the people around him. In the early seasons, when someone Peter cared about was hurt or struggling, there was a response. Not always the right response, frequently a deeply wrong response, but a response that acknowledged that the hurt had registered, that the struggling person was a person, that something was owed to them by virtue of the relationship. In the later seasons, this registering increasingly failed to happen. Peter would be present for moments of genuine pain in the people around him, and simply not notice and not care, or notice and find it amusing. That failure to register is the most diagnostic symptom of the character's decline. It is the specific thing that separates a lovable fool from an actual one. There is a version of Peter Griffin that never got to exist. A version of that character where the qualities of the early seasons, the love, the warmth, the way he was fundamentally a good person whose faults were a matter of intelligence and impulse rather than character, were allowed to develop rather than be stripped away. Where the story of a working class father navigating a world that was often confusing to him could have gone somewhere meaningful over 20 plus seasons. That version is the promise the early Peter made. And it is a promise that was quietly discarded somewhere around the 8th season, never really retrieved, and never honestly mourned. You can still see the ghost of it sometimes. In the way Seth MacFarlane delivers certain lines, in the particular softness that occasionally surfaces in Peter's voice during a moment, that the script has actually given him something human to work with. The performance never fully abandoned the character that was built in those first 3 seasons. It is the writing that did, and that is, perhaps, the saddest part of the whole thing. The talent was always there, the voice was always there. The foundation had been built carefully and solidly. It was the choices made on top of that foundation that hollowed it out, one season at a time, until what stood there was something that wore Peter's face but had lost the thing that made Peter worth watching. The promise of Peter Griffin was a character who could make you laugh until your sides hurt precisely because, underneath all the chaos, you believed in him. The later seasons never quite found their way back to that, and they never really stopped to ask whether they should. Section 3. The Promise of Brian Griffin. If Peter Griffin's decline is a story about warmth being replaced by cruelty, then Brian Griffin's decline is a story about intelligence being replaced by the performance of intelligence. And there is something uniquely painful about that, because Brian was the character who was supposed to be above the chaos. He was the one who saw clearly. He was the steady point around which the rest of the show's madness could spin. In the very first season of Family Guy, Brian Griffin was a revelation. Not because a talking dog was a new idea, fiction has had talking animals for as long as there has been fiction, but because of what the writers chose to do with the concept. Brian was not funny because he was a dog who could talk. Brian was funny because he was the most intelligent person in a household full of people who would never know it. And he had the particular combination of patience and weariness that comes from spending years being the smartest one in any given room while being, by legal and social definition, a pet. He drove a Toyota Prius. He held a martini glass with the casual ease of someone who had been doing it for decades. He had opinions about literature that were specific enough to be convincing, without being so specific that they became exclusionary. He was a failed writer, which gave him a vulnerability that balanced out the intelligence. He drank a little too much. He had feelings for Lois that he kept carefully buried, letting them surface only occasionally and always pulling them back before they could cause real damage. He was unlucky in love in the way that people who understand too much about their own flaws often are. He was, in other words, a fully realized character with an interior life, and he was all of this while also being, technically, a dog. His friendship with Peter was one of the best things in those early seasons. They should not have been close, they had almost nothing in common. Peter was loud and impulsive and had no patience for anything that required more than a few seconds of focused thought. Brian was quiet and considered, and had built his entire sense of self on the idea that thought was what separated him from the chaos around him, and yet they genuinely liked each other. Peter made Brian laugh in spite of himself. Brian gave Peter something approaching wisdom, even if Peter ignored it 9 times out of 10. The friendship felt real because it was built on genuine affection rather than shared interests, and a genuine affection across enormous differences is one of the more human things a relationship can be, yeah? And then there was Brian and Stewie. The relationship between Brian and Stewie was one of the great slow burn developments in those early seasons of Family Guy. In the first season and into the second, they did not have much of a relationship at all. Brian was one of the few characters who could understand Stewie, because Stewie's elaborate speeches and plans were largely invisible to everyone else. But this was more a running joke than a foundation for anything. The foundation came later, in the second season episode Road to Rhode Island, which sent the two of them on a road trip together and discovered in the process that these two characters, an alcoholic failed writer of a dog and an evil genius baby, had extraordinary chemistry. That episode, written by Gary Janetti and directed by Dan Povenmire, was nominated for a Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program. It was the first road to episode, and it perfected a format that would become one of the show's most reliable sources of genuine quality across many seasons. Brian and Stewie traveling together, arguing with each other, looking out for each other in spite of themselves, finding in their unlikely pairing something neither of them quite had with anyone else. The promise of Brian Griffin was a character who could ground the show's madness in something recognizable. A character who could be genuinely funny and genuinely kind and genuinely flawed all at the same time. A character whose intelligence was not just a personality trait, but a lens through which the audience could process the chaos unfolding around him. But something happened after the revival. The political opinions, always a small part of Brian's character, began to expand. Not a little, enormously. Where in the early seasons Brian's liberal views were just one ingredient in a well-seasoned character, after the cancellation and revival they became the dominant flavor. Entire scenes would be devoted to Brian delivering speeches about whatever issue the writers wanted to address that week. He became a vehicle for opinion rather than a character with opinions, which is a fundamentally different and much less interesting thing. And the hypocrisy set in. This is what ultimately turned Brian from a beloved character into something that a large portion of the audience came to genuinely dislike. The Brian of the early seasons was intelligent, and therefore his convictions had weight. You could believe that he had actually read the books he mentioned. You could believe that his moral positions came from somewhere real. But as the seasons went on, a gap opened between what Brian claimed to be and how he actually behaved, and the show seemed uninterested in treating that gap as a character flaw worth exploring. Instead, it presented Brian as simultaneously righteous in his positions and increasingly monstrous in his personal conduct, without any apparent awareness that these two things were in contradiction. He became a womanizer who used his pretensions to intellectualism as a dating strategy. He became dismissive of Stewie, the one character who had always understood him and believed in him, in episodes like Brian Wright's A Bestseller, where his sudden fame turned him into something utterly unrecognizable. He became the kind of person who, as Quagmire puts it in the season 8 episode, Jerome is the new black. In what became one of the most discussed speeches in the show's history, pretends to love women for their souls while only dating them for their bodies, and buys them a copy of The Catcher in the Rye and then lectures them with some seventh grade interpretation about how Holden Caulfield is a profound intellectual. That speech is fascinating for reasons beyond its content. The writers clearly knew what Brian had become. They were not oblivious to the transformation. Quagmire's monologue is too specific, too accurate, too well observed to be anything other than a deliberate acknowledgement that the character had gone wrong somewhere. And the audience responded to it with a kind of grim relief. The relief of having someone finally say out loud what you had been thinking for several seasons. But the speech changed nothing. That is the part that made it ultimately more frustrating than satisfying. If Quagmire's confrontation had been a turning point, if Brian had taken that moment and done something with it, if the writers had used it as the beginning of a genuine recalibration, it might have been one of the most effective pieces of character work the show ever did. Instead, Brian continued in the same direction, slightly more aggressive in his provocations of Quagmire, slightly more extreme in his worst behaviors, as though the speech had not happened at all. The death and resurrection of Brian in season 12 is perhaps the most perfectly emblematic moment in the entire history of the show's relationship with its own promises. In the episode Life of Brian, Brian is hit by a car and dies. The family mourns him. Stewie, who has always loved Brian with a completeness that he rarely showed toward anyone else, is devastated. The grief in that episode is handled surprisingly well. There is something genuinely moving about watching Stewie say goodbye to the one being in the world who had always been his constant, his partner in strange adventures, his audience of one. And then, 2 episodes later, the show reversed it. In Christmas Guy, Stewie uses a stolen time travel device to go back and prevent Brian from being hit by the car. Brian is alive again. Everything resets. The grief, the new dog named Vinny brought in to fill the void, the family's adjustment to a changed world, all of it is undone in the span of a single episode. When Brian returned, it made national news. It trended across social media. People had opinions about it with an intensity that was remarkable for a moment in an animated comedy. But the dominant reaction, once the initial relief had settled, was the recognition that the show had used one of its most important characters as bait. The death was never meant to stick. It was a stunt. It was designed to generate buzz, to get people talking, to drive up viewership for a few weeks, and when it had done its job, it was reversed as efficiently as a magician by revealing that the card book was in his pocket all along. There is a deeper problem with that reversal beyond the manipulation involved in it, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. The death of a character in a long-running show done well is an opportunity, not just to generate an emotional reaction, though that is part of it. It is an opportunity to say something about the character who died, to give them a final statement, to let the other characters show who they are in the face of loss. The grief episodes in good television are often the best episodes because grief forces characters out of their normal operating modes and into something more raw and honest. Brian's death episode was handled with more care than most things the later show produced. The scene where the Griffin family gathered around him in his final moments, where Stewie held his friend's paw and was unable to say everything he needed to say, was genuinely moving. It demonstrated that somewhere in the show's creative team, the memory of who Brian and Stewie were to each other had been preserved. And then the reversal undid all of it. Not just in the literal narrative sense. It undid it retroactively, reaching backward into the grief episode and draining it of the weight it had earned. Because once you know that Brian was coming back in 2 episodes, the death is not a death. It is a vacation. And grief for a vacation is not grief at all. After his return, by most accounts, Brian got worse. The traits that Quagmire had called out became more extreme rather than less. The selfishness reached new heights. The pretension calcified into something almost aggressive. He destroyed Stewie's teddy bear Rupert, chewing it to pieces while drunk. He found a woman trapped in a car about to fall into the ocean, and chose not to rescue her when he discovered she was a mother and therefore married. He gave both Chris and Stewie herpes through reckless behavior, and treated this as an inconvenience rather than a genuine harm. The list went on, and it went on without consequence, without growth, without any acknowledgement from the story that these were not the actions of the character the show had originally built. The irony of the Rupert incident is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it captures something important about the nature of this particular character's decline. Rupert was Stewie's teddy bear, and Rupert mattered because of what he represented within the relationship between Stewie and Brian. In the early seasons, and in the better later episodes, Stewie's attachment to Rupert was played as the one clear, uncomplicated expression of vulnerability that the character allowed himself. Stewie could talk about world domination and intellectual superiority, and the inadequacy of every human being he encountered. But Rupert was simply loved, with the wholehearted, undefended love that very young children bring to the things that make them feel safe. Brian knew this. The Brian of the early seasons knew this and treated it with the care it deserved, which was part of what made his friendship with Stewie feel real. The Brian who drunkenly chewed Rupert to pieces did not have access to that knowledge anymore, or had access to it and chose to disregard it, which is worse. In either case, it was the most efficient possible summary of what had happened to the character. The thing that most clearly demonstrated his capacity for genuine care had been turned into an instrument of deliberate cruelty. There are still episodes scattered across the later seasons, like small bright patches in an otherwise dim landscape, where Brian behaves like the character he was supposed to be. There are moments where the care for Stewie surfaces with the clarity and depth it had in those early Road to episodes. There are moments where the sarcasm arrives with genuine wit rather than defensive arrogance. These moments prove that the writers had not entirely forgotten who Brian was. They could access him when they wanted to. They just increasingly chose not to. One of the most interesting things about Brian's decline, viewed from a distance, is the relationship between his political soapboxing and his general character deterioration. These two things became intertwined in a way that was damaging to both. When a character uses political speeches as a primary mode of expression, they stop being a character who has political views and become a political view that happens to have a character attached. The distinction matters enormously. Viewers who agreed with Brian's political positions found his speechifying just as off-putting as viewers who disagreed with them, because the issue was not the content of the views, but the way the character had been hollowed out to accommodate them. A character making a speech is not a character having a conversation. A speech is a performance, and Brian increasingly performed his intelligence and his virtue rather than demonstrating them through action. The writers seemed to understand this problem at some level because they kept having other characters call Brian out for exactly this quality. The Quagmire speech is the most famous example, but it was not the only one. Multiple characters across multiple episodes pointed out the gap between who Brian claimed to be and how he actually behaved. Each of these moments was, on its face, a kind of course correction, an acknowledgement that the character needed to be challenged and brought up short. but the course corrections never held. The next episode would find Brian back at his worst, as though the confrontation had never happened. This pattern, the show recognizing its own problems and then choosing to continue with them anyway, is one of the more peculiar features of the later seasons. There was clearly some awareness in the writer's room that certain things had gone wrong. The awareness just never translated into sustained change. The promise of Brian Griffin was a character who could be the show's moral center without being preachy about it, who could be both deeply flawed and genuinely decent, who could make you laugh with his intelligence and feel something with his vulnerability. He was, at his best, a character who made the world of Family Guy feel like it had weight because he moved through it with enough awareness to register that weight. What the later seasons gave us instead was a character whose intelligence was increasingly performative, whose moral positions were increasingly disconnected from his behavior, and whose relationships with the people around him had curdled from genuine affection into something transactional and often unkind. The Brian Griffin of seasons 1 through 3 was the best friend you never had. The character who saw clearly and cared genuinely and was honest even when the honesty cost him something. The Brian of the later seasons was the smartest person in any room who had forgotten that being smart is not the same as being good. And somewhere in that forgetting, something irreplaceable was lost. Section 4. The Promise of Stewie Griffin. There has never been another character in animated television quite like the Stewie Griffin of the first 3 seasons of Family Guy. Not before, not since. There have been villainous characters in cartoons, certainly. There have been sinister masterminds and diabolical schemers. But there was something about Stewie that was in a category entirely its own. Something that came from the specific, irreducible strangeness of the concept. He was 1 year old. He wore a yellow shirt and a diaper. He sat in a high chair and ate baby food that he openly despised. And he wanted to take over the world and murder his mother. The comedy was not just the gap between what Stewie looked like and what he was. It was the commitment. The total, unironic, completely earnest commitment of a tiny baby to the project of global domination. Stewie did not want to take over the world as a joke. He did not plot his mother's assassination with a wink. He did it with the focused seriousness of someone who had given this a great deal of thought and had arrived at a plan of action that he was prepared to execute with absolute dedication. His British accent, based by Seth MacFarlane, on the voice of actor Rex Harrison, particularly his performance in the 1964 film My Fair Lady, was the perfect expression of this. It was the voice of a man who had lived long enough to develop strong opinions about everything and was not prepared to waste breath on social niceties. He built a laser gun in his crib. He constructed a mind control device in his bedroom behind a wall of toys and stuffed animals that served as cover. He had a time machine, which he used as early as the first season. He spoke in complete paragraphs while everyone around him either failed to understand him or simply did not notice him speaking at all, which was its own layer of comedy. Lois would pick Stewie up, squeeze his chubby little cheeks, coo at him about what a precious, wonderful baby he was, while Stewie silently recounted to himself the 17 ways in which he was currently planning to bring about her destruction. The dramatic irony was the engine of the comedy. The audience knew. The characters, with the partial exception of Brian, did not. Every interaction between Stewie and Lois carried this extra dimension, this knowledge that the person being hugged was the one who had spent the morning calibrating the charge on a ray gun specifically designed to disintegrate her. That tension, sustained across dozens of episodes, never wore out its welcome in those early seasons because the writers kept finding new ways to approach it. New situations in which the gap between the baby everyone saw and the supervillain only the audience knew about could generate something surprising. In the first season episode, Chitty Chitty Death Bang, which aired in May of 1999 and featured Stewie's first birthday, the character's identity as an evil genius is established in full. It is Stewie's birthday, and he is convinced that a mysterious man in a robe who has been leaving notes about his mission is going to come for him on this day and that he must be ready. The entire episode plays the baby's paranoia with complete earnestness, which is what makes it funny. Stewie is not delusional. He is operating on real information. He just happens to be a baby, and the world around him is organized around the false assumption that babies are harmless. What made this concept so rich was that it was essentially inexhaustible. The premise of a baby who is secretly a genius villain is not a joke that can only be told one way. It can be told from the perspective of the plans themselves. It can be told from the perspective of the relationship with Lois, which was simultaneously Stewie's greatest frustration and most consistent motive. It can be told from the perspective of Stewie's relationship with the broader world, which kept failing to recognize him for what he was. It can be told from the perspective of the technology, the increasingly elaborate devices that a one-year-old had somehow managed to build in a house full of adults who never seemed to notice. Every angle offered something. Every approach had more to say. The writers, including McFarlane himself, disagreed. Their assessment, which McFarlane stated publicly, was that the evil baby concept had run its course, that they had taken the joke as far as it could go, that continuing to revisit the same premise would make Stewie feel stale, and that what the character needed was to grow in a new direction. This decision was made beginning in Season 4, after the show returned from cancellation, and it accelerated through Seasons 5 and 6 and 7 until, by Season 8 and beyond, the Stewie Griffin on screen bore only a superficial resemblance to the character who had arrived in 1999 with a laser gun and a detailed plan for world domination. The new Stewie was softer, more emotional, more interested in his personal identity and his insecurities and his relationship with Brian than in building machines that could reorder the fundamental structure of human civilization. The world domination plots became rarer and eventually almost entirely absent. The attempts to kill Lois, once the through line that connected nearly every episode in which Stewie appeared, faded away. In their place came storylines about belonging, about identity, about what it means to be a person. In the world when you are still figuring out who you are. The Season 6 two-part episode, Stewie Kills Lois, and Lois Kills Stewie, was, as the transcript that inspired this script's structure notes, the unofficial farewell to the original version of the character. In these episodes, the show finally gave Stewie what he had been building toward for 6 seasons. He kills Lois. He takes over the world. He becomes the dictator he always wanted to be. It is thrilling and dramatic and darkly funny in the way that the best early Stewie material always was. And then it is revealed to be a simulation on Stewie's computer. None of it actually happened. The world is reset, and the evil genius is quietly retired. It is hard to overstate what was lost in that retirement. The argument that the writers made, and that defenders of the change still make, is that the softer, more emotional Stewie opened up narrative possibilities that the evil genius character could not have accessed. His friendship with Brian became something genuinely moving in ways that cold, calculating evil baby Stewie could not have achieved. Episodes like Christmas Guy, in which Stewie travels back in time to save Brian from being hit by a car, demonstrated a capacity for love and sacrifice that the villain version of the character would never have expressed. The new Stewie had an arc. He had growth. He had a relationship with Brian that was, at its best, one of the most honest and touching things the show ever produced. All of that is true, but the counter-argument is equally true, and it is this. Growth is not automatically valuable simply because it is growth. The direction of the change matters. What you gain matters, but so does what you give up. And what the show gave up when it retired Evil Stewie was not a one dimensional joke that had exhausted itself. It was one of the most original and durable character concepts in the history of the medium. There are dozens of animated characters who are sensitive and emotionally complex and searching for their identity. There are hundreds of cartoon buddy pairings where two mismatched personalities go on road trips together and grow closer through shared adversity. Those are fine templates. They can produce excellent television. But they are not rare. They are not things that had never quite been done before. The evil genius baby who plotted matricide between naps was rare. It was unique. It was the kind of character that the medium of animation, with its freedom from the constraints of physical performance and the more literal requirements of live action, was particularly suited to produce and sustain. And the writers walked away from it before it had come close to exhausting what it had to offer. The argument that the show needed to retire Evil Stewie because it had nowhere left to go is undermined by the fact that the show has now spent far more seasons with the softer version of Stewie than it ever did with the original. If the creative team had enough material to sustain emotional Stewie across 15 plus seasons, the idea that they could not have found more to do with one of the most inventive character concepts in animation history is simply not convincing. The creative well was not dry. The writers just decided they were done digging. What remained was a Stewie who was still entertaining in individual episodes. Still funny, still capable of moments of genuine wit and, in his better scenes with Brian, genuine feeling. But he had lost the quality that made him irreplaceable. In those early seasons, every scene with Stewie had a charge to it, an unpredictability. You did not know what he was going to do, but you knew it was going to be strange and deliberate and somehow both childlike and terrifying. That quality is not something you can replicate with a more conventionally drawn character. It required the original premise. In the 23rd season, the show was still finding things to do with Stewie, not always successfully. The character worked well in parody episodes, worked well in certain Stewie and Brian adventures, worked well in moments that recalled something of his original voice. But the through line was gone. The project of world domination, the vendetta against Lois, the cold and absolute certainty of purpose that had made early Stewie so compelling, was absent. What remained was a character who was likable and sometimes very funny, but who felt occasionally like someone impersonating a version of themselves. The promise of Stewie Griffin was a character unlike any other in animation. One who combined a baby's physical vulnerability with a villain's absolute confidence in his own powers, who turned every interaction with his family into a scene from a thriller that only the audience could see, who made the ordinary suburban setting of the show feel genuinely dangerous in the funniest possible way. That promise was honored fully for 3 seasons, and then it was gently but decisively put away. And the character who replaced it, while not without merit, was not what had been promised. The original Stewie was dangerous. The later Stewie was pleasant. For a character whose entire identity was built on being the exact opposite of pleasant, that is the definition of a broken promise. Section 5, The Promise of Meg Griffin. In the first 3 seasons of Family Guy, Meg Griffin was a perfectly ordinary teenage girl. That sentence might seem like a description of a boring character. It is not. In context, in a household containing a reckless human demolition derby of a father, a wife who was somehow keeping the whole enterprise from collapsing entirely, a baby who was secretly a supervillain, and a dog with a graduate school education and a drinking problem, an ordinary teenage girl was a radical choice. Meg was the relatable one. She was the audience surrogate in a sense that none of the other characters could be, because the other characters were too extreme, too exaggerated, too fundamentally strange to serve as reflections of normal human experience. Meg was recognizable. Meg was real. She attended James Woods Regional High School. She wanted to be popular and was not. She had crushes that went unrequited. She had a family that was chaotic and occasionally embarrassing, in the specific way that families are embarrassing to teenagers, which is to say, constantly and in public. She wore a pink hat and glasses and clothes that were, by the show's visual standards, relentlessly uninteresting, which was the point. The uninterestingness was itself interesting because it stood out in a household that was never, in any context, uninteresting. The treatment Meg received in those first 3 seasons was mild. Her father sometimes said insensitive things to her without noticing. The kids at school were unkind in the way that kids at school are unkind to the ones who have not yet figured out how to perform the kind of coolness that high school temporarily requires. Her family paid less attention to her than she deserved. But underneath all of that, the early show made it clear that the Griffins loved Meg. Peter might be unaware of it 90% of the time, but it was there. He was her dad. She was his daughter. The relationship had the ordinary warmth of a parent-child connection that both people were too stubborn or too busy or too caught up in their own chaos to express properly. That early version of Meg was making a quiet, steady promise. The promise of a character who represented normal human longing in an abnormal world, and who might, given time and care, be developed into something genuinely moving. The ordinary girl who felt unseen in an extraordinary family had the potential to become something rich. There were stories available in that premise, stories about visibility and self-worth, and the particular loneliness of being the one person in a room who does not know the name of their own superpower because they have not discovered it yet. None of those stories were told. Instead, starting around the 4th season and accelerating dramatically through the 5th, 6th, 7th, and beyond, the treatment of Meg shifted from mild neglect to something considerably darker. The jokes about her being boring were replaced by jokes about her being ugly. Then the jokes about her being ugly were replaced by treatment that was not quite joke and not quite cruelty, but occupied the uncomfortable territory between the two. The family, collectively and individually, began to treat Meg with open contempt. Not the kind of contempt that contains any residual warmth. The real kind. The kind that communicates to the person on the receiving end that they do not quite count as a full person. Peter's contribution to this shift was the most dramatic. He went from being an inattentive father who occasionally said the wrong thing to being a man who actively seemed to resent his own daughter's existence. He insulted her appearance routinely. He physically abused her in ways the show framed as comedy. In one episode, a flashback reveals that Peter and Lois tried to leave Meg at a fire station as a baby. That scene is presented as a joke. The audience is supposed to laugh. The writers had arrived at a place where the image of parents trying to abandon their infant daughter was available as a punchline, and nobody in the room had raised a hand to question whether it should be. The rest of the family followed. Lois, who had been Meg's most reliable source of support in the early seasons, became increasingly indifferent to her daughter's suffering, and occasionally complicit in it. Chris moved from being Meg's sibling to being one of her tormentors. Even Stewie, who had barely registered Meg's existence in the early seasons, began contributing his share of casual cruelty to her ongoing misery. There is a particular quality to sustained comedic abuse in a long-running show, which is that it stops being comedy and starts being something else entirely, something closer to a statement about the target's fundamental worth. If you tell a joke at someone's expense once, it is a joke. If you tell it 100 times across 10 seasons, you are no longer making a joke. You are making a claim. And the claim the show made about Meg Griffin for a very long time was that she was worthless. and that her suffering was funny, and that the appropriate response to her wanting things to be different was for her to accept that they would not be. The 10th season episode, Seahorse Seashell Party, is the most discussed example of this dynamic. Trapped in their house during a hurricane with no television remote and nowhere to go, the Griffin family does what the Griffin family has been doing for 6 seasons. They pile their frustrations onto Meg, and Meg, having had enough, finally snaps. She confronts her father. She confronts her mother. She confronts her brother. She names the specific ways in which each of them has failed her, and she does it with the clarity and precision of someone who has been cataloging grievances for a very long time and has finally stopped pretending that she has not. For approximately 10 minutes of television, it felt like justice. The writing in those confrontation scenes was sharper than almost anything the show had produced in several seasons. The observations were specific. The emotional logic was real. When Meg pointed out to Lois that she had cheated on her husband multiple times and yet had the nerve to make Meg feel bad about her own choices, it landed with the particular weight of a long, true thing being said for the first time. When she turned to Peter and described the specific ways in which his behavior had been not just unhelpful, but actively harmful, you wanted to stand up. And then the episode ended. After Meg's confrontation, the family begins to turn on each other. Without their shared target, without Meg absorbing all the dysfunction, they have no way to manage their collective aggression, and it turns inward. The episode concludes with Meg going to Brian and explaining what she has realized, that her role in the family is to be the lightning rod, that her willingness to absorb everyone's cruelty is what keeps the family from falling apart entirely. And so she takes it back. She goes back to being the punching bag, willingly. The episode frames this as a heroic sacrifice, which is perhaps the most troubling interpretive choice the show made in its entire run. The message of that ending, unintentional as it may or may not have been, is that victims of abuse should accept their abuse because their suffering serves a stabilizing function for the people who are abusing them. It tells the audience that Meg's standing up for herself was a kind of selfishness because it disrupted the people whose lives depended on having someone to hurt. It says that the correct response to recognizing that you are being mistreated is to stop recognizing it and go back to allowing it. Critics were not kind to that ending. The AV Club's review of the episode gave it a grade of D+ and noted specifically that nobody cares about any member of the Griffin family the way we care about every last Simpson. That observation is worth sitting with. The Simpsons had built an audience that genuinely cared about its characters over 30+ seasons. Family Guy had managed the same thing in its early seasons, and somewhere along the way it had lost the ability to make that caring sustainable because it had traded the humanity of its characters for something louder and less durable. The later seasons did begin to pull back from the most extreme Meg abuse, beginning roughly around season 14 and 15. More women were added to the writing staff, and their presence had a measurable effect on how Meg was written. She began getting episodes where she was competent and strong, and occasionally even cool. She fought back. She showed resilience. The gratuitous cruelty that had defined her role for nearly 10 seasons became less frequent and eventually, by season 22 and beyond, largely absent. Lois reconciled with Meg in a genuinely touching episode called Snap Plea Decision. The show seemed to recognize belatedly that it had done this character a disservice that deserved to be corrected. But the damage was done. It could not be entirely repaired. For roughly 10 seasons, Meg Griffin was not a character. She was a function. She was the place where the show put its worst impulses when it had nowhere else for them to go. And the extraordinary thing is that all that time, through all of those seasons, Mila Kunis kept showing up and doing the work. kept making Meg's pain feel real, kept bringing the kind of vocal performance to the role that the writing so often failed to deserve. You can hear in Kunis's performance in the Seahorse Seashell Party episode exactly what Meg was always supposed to be. The writing could not diminish what the performance was offering. It could only fail to use it. The promise of Meg Griffin was a character who could represent the most universally human experience in a show full of spectacular inhumanity. The girl who just wanted to be seen, who wanted her family to be proud of her, who wanted to feel like she belonged somewhere. Those desires are the simplest and most universal things a person can want. The show had a character capable of embodying them, and it chose instead, for a long and uncomfortable stretch, to treat her as an object of ridicule. That is not just a missed opportunity, it is a promise broken in the most direct possible way, not through negligence, but through deliberate, sustained choice. Section 6. The Promise of Lois Griffin. Lois Griffin is in many ways the invisible broken promise in the Family Guy story. When people talk about the show's decline, they talk about Peter, about Brian, about Stewie, about Meg. Lois does not always come up in these conversations, perhaps because her collapse was less dramatic and more gradual than the others, perhaps because she occupied a different function in the ensemble. But the Lois of the early seasons was making a specific and important promise. And the way that promise was quietly broken over time deserves to be examined on its own terms. In seasons 1 through 3, Lois was the load-bearing wall of the Griffin household. Not because she was perfect, not because she was without her own complicated history or her own concealed capacity for trouble. In fact, the early seasons were unusually honest about the fact that Lois was not simply a straight woman in a house full of clowns. She had a past. She came from money, the daughter of Carter and Barbara Pewterschmidt, and she had walked away from that world for reasons that were occasionally glimpsed and never fully explained. Reasons that involved Peter in ways that were sometimes touching and sometimes inexplicable. She had been a piano teacher, which she gave up bit by bit as her household responsibilities expanded. She had made choices, some of them bad, some of them quietly extraordinary. And she had arrived at middle age in a suburban Rhode Island house with a husband who was genuinely difficult to live with, and 3 children who each presented their own specific challenges. What made early Lois work was that she was clearly a complex person who had chosen to prioritize her family in a way that cost her, but who did so with enough self-awareness to understand the cost. She was not a martyr. She was not unaware of what her intelligence and capability might have achieved in a different life. She simply loved Peter, loved her kids, and had decided that this was where she was going to put her energy. And that choice felt real because the show gave her enough depth to make it feel like a real choice rather than a foregone conclusion imposed by the requirements of the genre. She was patient with Peter without being passive. She called him out when he needed to be called out. She drew lines, and when he crossed them, there were consequences. Not permanent consequences, because this was still a sitcom operating on the principle that the status quo would largely be restored by the time the credits rolled, but real enough consequences that you believed the marriage was something both people had chosen and were choosing every day against alternatives. Her relationship with her children was differentiated in ways that felt true. Meg was the one she worried about most, the one who seemed most fragile. Chris was the one she gently tried to redirect from his father's worst tendencies. Stewie was the one she could not fully understand, which added a specific texture to the comedy of his villainous designs, because Lois's failure to perceive the threat came from genuine love rather than carelessness. The early Lois had a piano. She played it. It mattered to her. The fact that she had a skill, a real skill that she had developed over years, and that was hers and not her family's or her husband's or her past, said something important about who this character was. She was a person with a life before the show started, and a life beyond the edges of whatever episode you happen to be watching. That completeness is what the early seasons gave her. The later seasons gave her something different. Starting around the 8th season and continuing with increasing severity through to roughly the 21st, Lois was flanderized in a specific and not especially original direction. Her patience was replaced by volatility. Her intelligence was replaced by a kind of performative superiority that was more about asserting authority than actually exercising it. The warmth that had characterized her relationship with Peter, the genuine love that she had for this difficult, ridiculous man, became something that surfaced only occasionally, surrounded by episodes in which their marriage looked less like a choice and more like a mutual imprisonment. The hypocrisy increased dramatically. The early Lois had flaws that were kept in a kind of balance with her virtues. The later Lois accumulated a history of significant moral failures that the show treated inconsistently, sometimes using them to make her seem interesting and complex, and at other times ignoring them entirely so that she could occupy the moral high ground in a given episode's argument without the narrative acknowledging that she had forfeited any claim to it. She cheated on Peter in various ways and at various times, with this history being both dramatized and referenced to the point where it became a running element of the show's mythology rather than something handled with any consistent weight. She stole prescription painkillers that had been prescribed for Brian after an injury. She failed Meg in the specific ways that a mother can fail a daughter by not protecting her and sometimes joining in the attacks. She became increasingly self-centered in ways that the early Lois, who had demonstrably subordinated her own desires to her family's needs, would have been unrecognizable as. There is a version of this evolution that could have been genuinely interesting. A story about what happens to a person who has spent decades suppressing their own needs for the sake of a family and who eventually begins to find their way back to some version of themselves would have had real emotional power. The early show had laid the groundwork for exactly that story. The later seasons had the ingredients. What they lacked was the patience and the craft to tell it honestly, rather than simply using Lois's complications as material for isolated episodes with no connection to any larger story. Alex Borstein, who has voiced Lois from the beginning, is one of the most talented voice performers in the business. She brought a specificity and a warmth to the character that the writing did not always deserve. You can hear in her performance across all the seasons the ghost of the Lois who was carefully and thoughtfully constructed in those first 3 years. Even when the writing reduced her to a caricature of her worst qualities, Borstein found ways to leave the door open for something more complicated. The performance never lost the character, even when the scripts had. The promise of Lois Griffin was a woman who was both the anchor of her household and a fully realized person with her own history and desires and compromises. A woman who had chosen her life deliberately and whose choice was worth something because it was a real choice. The later seasons kept the outline of this character but gradually replaced her substance with something coarser and less interesting, until the woman who had once seemed like the most rounded person in one of television's most chaotic households became just another member of the chaos herself. She began getting some of her complexity back around the 21st and 22nd seasons. The addition of more women to the writing staff seemed to correlate with a broader improvement in how the female characters were handled. Lois and Meg both beginning to recover some of what had been lost. But 20-plus seasons is a long time to coast on the promise of a character without honoring it, and the recovery, welcome as it was, could not undo the years of drift that preceded it. Section 7. The Promise of Chris Griffin. There is something that happens in long-running ensemble shows where the characters who do not have the loudest, most immediately legible story get quietly forgotten. Not written out, not changed dramatically, just gradually allowed to recede into the background, to appear in scenes when the plot requires a body in a given room and to disappear when it does not, to have their qualities referenced but not really developed, to occupy a space in the credits that does not quite correspond to a space in the stories being told. Chris Griffin was always at some risk of this fate. He was the middle child in terms of narrative real estate, standing between the extreme characters, Peter and Stewie and Brian, who generated the most story, and the tragic character Meg, who generated the most pathos. Chris was funny in a gentle, low-key way. He was, as the show's Britannica entry notes, described as a friendly, laid-back, and slow-witted teenage boy who is a younger version of Peter physically but intellectually, often shows more potential. That last detail was the promise, that Chris looked like Peter but might, in a different environment, become something different from Peter. In the early seasons, Chris had a specific quality that distinguished him from his father in ways the show was careful to maintain. He was kinder, less aggressive, more likely to pause before acting, even if the pause was brief and the action that followed still inadvisable. He had a gift for drawing, established in the third season episode The Sun Also Draws, which led to an episode about the tension between natural talent and parental expectations. He had moments of surprising clarity, lines of dialogue that arrived out of nowhere and contained more genuine insight than anyone in the room, including the audience quite expected from a kid who spent most of his time being gently confused by the world. There was also, in the early seasons, the ongoing joke about the evil monkey in Chris's closet, which was played with a deadpan commitment that made it one of the more reliably funny recurring elements of the early show. The monster in the closet is one of the oldest comedy structures in existence, the object of childhood terror treated as matter-of-fact reality, and the show handled it well. It was later revealed that the monkey had a legitimate grievance, which was a sweet and slightly surprising subversion, but the original execution was sharp. And the promise of Chris Griffin was a character who might serve as a kind of emotional counterpoint to his father. Not in the way that Meg did, through contrast and suffering, but through a genuine gentleness that might eventually become something more. A young man who had the capacity to be better than the world he was growing up in, if someone gave him the right environment and the right encouragement. The later seasons largely forgot to pursue that promise. Chris became increasingly defined by his resemblance to Peter, the intellectual limitations, the impulsivity, the tendency toward bad decisions rather than by the qualities that distinguished him from Peter. The drawing talent was referenced occasionally, but never developed into anything that felt central to who he was. The moments of unexpected wisdom became rarer as the seasons went on. He participated in the abuse of Meg more and more actively, which was both inconsistent with the early version of his character and narratively damaging, because it meant that none of the Griffin children were exempt from the show's most disturbing ongoing dynamic. By the middle seasons and beyond, Chris was largely a background character. He was present. He appeared in episodes. He had storylines occasionally, but he did not feel like a character with a trajectory anymore, with a sense of where he was going or what he was becoming. He was furniture that could sometimes talk. In certain later episodes, particularly as the show began to pull back from some of its worst habits, Chris showed flashes of the character he might have been. More grounded episodes that gave him room to be gentle and funny, and occasionally surprising. The potential never entirely disappeared, but it was allowed to sit unused for so many seasons that it almost did not matter that it was still there. The promise of Chris Griffin was modest compared to some of the others the show made. But modest promises deserve to be honored too. The quiet potential in that early characterization, the sense that here was a boy who might grow into something genuinely good, was a real thing. It deserved better than to be replaced by a diminished version of his father. Section 8. The Supporting World. Every great show builds not just its central characters, but the world around them. The promise of a world, the sense that there are people living lives worth knowing about beyond the edges of the main story, is part of what makes a piece of fiction feel real rather than assembled. In its early seasons, Family Guy built a supporting world with genuine care. Joe Swanson, the neighbor. When Joe was introduced in the first season episode A Hero Sits Next Door, he arrived with a specific and well-observed dynamic. He was everything Peter was not: disciplined, athletic, competent, respected in the community, and the fact that he accomplished all of this while being a wheelchair user was handled with a deftness that the early show managed more often than its reputation might suggest. The joke of Peter being jealous of someone who seemed to have every advantage even while facing a significant physical limitation was a real joke with real layers to it. Joe's wheelchair was a fact of his character, not the entirety of his character. He had a wife, Bonnie, who was pregnant for what became a running gag about the extraordinary duration of the pregnancy. He had a son, Kevin, who served in the military. He had a life beyond his disability. The later seasons treated Joe far less carefully. His disability became increasingly the point of the joke rather than a fact about a character who transcended it. His marriage to Bonnie went through a prolonged rough patch in which her dissatisfaction with their life together was played sometimes for drama and sometimes for comedy, with the show uncertain which it wanted to do and therefore doing neither particularly well. The respect that his community had for him in those early episodes was replaced by a dynamic in which his friends, particularly Peter, often treated him with a contempt they had never shown him when he was the new, impressive neighbor. Glenn Quagmire, the show's most openly transgressive recurring character, occupied a specific and necessary role in the early ensemble. He was, to put it plainly, a man of extreme and poorly controlled appetites, and the comedy of his character in the early seasons came from the particular way in which his absolute absence of restraint was depicted with a kind of cheerful matter-of-factness, as though the show were a documentary about a man who had simply organized his life around a different set of priorities than most people. He was funny in the specific way that extremity can be funny when it is drawn from a real observation about human nature, rather than simply assembled from shock value. The later seasons pushed Quagmire further in the direction of the shock value side of that equation, as they pushed nearly everything further, but Quagmire retained something the other characters lost. He retained a kind of self-awareness about what he was. He never claimed to be something better than he was, which gave him a weird integrity in contrast to, say, later seasons Brian, who made enormous claims about his own virtue while behaving execrably. Quagmire's speech about why he hates Brian in the 8th season episode Jerome is the New Black works not just as character comedy, but as a piece of genuine moral observation. And it works in part because Quagmire delivers it without any apparent awareness that he is making any claims for himself, only making accurate claims about Brian. Cleveland Brown. The show's most reliably gentle main character, Cleveland was characterized in those early seasons by an almost saintly patience and a dry, slightly melancholy humor that came from being the most normal person in a group of people who were normal only by comparison to each other. The joke that became most associated with him, the bathtub falls from the house gag, was a perfect example of how the show used visual comedy in its better years. The setup was always the same: Cleveland relaxing in his bath, a wall being broken through, the tub beginning to tip, and then the slow philosophical fall. And it was funny every single time because of how thoroughly the show committed to both the mundane setup and the spectacular consequence. Cleveland departed Family Guy to star in his own spin-off, The Cleveland Show, which ran from 2009 to 2013. He returned to Family Guy after that show's conclusion. His characterization shifted somewhat, as characters inevitably do when they spend time in a different context, but the fundamental gentleness of early Cleveland remained more intact than most of the show's ensemble. Perhaps because he was a secondary rather than primary character, and therefore subject to less aggressive flanderization. The supporting world that the early seasons built also included the broader geography of the fictional town itself, the Drunken Clam, where Peter and his friends gathered, the local television station with its anchor Tom Tucker and Asian correspondent Trisha Takanawa, the high school where Meg spent her unhappy days, the brewery where Peter eventually worked, the neighbors and acquaintances who populated the background of the show's world. All of these had a specificity that made the world feel inhabited rather than assembled. As the show went on and the ensemble was pushed to more extreme versions of themselves, the supporting world took on some of those extremities too. Characters who had been secondary became broader caricatures. Settings that had felt real became props. The world contracted around the show's increasingly narrow focus on the Griffin household itself, as though the writers had decided that the family's dysfunction was so interesting in its own right that the broader context was no longer necessary. This contraction was itself a loss. Part of what made the early show feel generous and lively was the sense that there was more to this world than the camera could show at any given moment. That Joe and Cleveland and Quagmire had lives that continued when they were not on screen. That the town had a texture and a history beyond what the Griffins needed it to have for any particular episode. The later show lost that generosity. It became more efficient and less alive. Section 9. The Promise of the Cutaway. The cutaway gag is Family Guy's most famous invention, or at least its most famous adoption. Since the technique had precedence in other comedies but was used by this show in a way that made it feel genuinely new. And for 3 seasons, it was exactly that, new and funny and precise in its deployment. In those first 3 seasons, a cutaway was a bonus. The main story of any given episode was strong enough to carry itself. The characters were developed enough that their interactions generated real comedy without the need for supplementary material. A scene would be building to a natural conclusion, or a character would make a comparison that invited an illustration, and the show would cut briefly to that illustration and then return, and the episode would continue. The cutaway was a seasoning. It added flavor without changing the fundamental nature of the dish. The things that made the early cutaways work were the same things that make any comedy work: specificity, surprise, and commitment. The jokes were specific to the moment that had generated them. They surprised you in the way that good comedy always surprises you, by arriving at a punchline from an unexpected direction. And they were committed to with the total earnestness that is the secret of most great comedy, the complete refusal to signal in advance that something is supposed to be funny. The first episode, Death Has a Shadow, aired on January 31st, 1999. Already featured cutaways. The format was baked in from the beginning. MacFarlane and the original writing team understood from the start that this technique was one of the show's defining tools. But understanding a tool and knowing how much to use it are different things, and in those early seasons, the balance was precisely right. When the show came back from cancellation in 2005, the cutaways changed. Not all at once and not irreversibly in the early revival seasons, but the change was visible and it was directional. The cutaways got longer. They appeared more frequently. The ratio between story and supplementary material began to shift, and it shifted in one direction only. By the middle seasons, the balance had inverted. Episodes that had once been stories decorated with cutaways had become collections of cutaways loosely organized around what remained of a story. South Park's two-part episode Cartoon Wars, which aired in 2006, made this point directly and sharply. Trey Parker and Matt Stone depicted Family Guy's writing process as a room full of manatees pushing idea balls around at random, suggesting that the connections between the show's setups and payoffs were not actually connections at all, just the appearance of connections. Whether this was a fair characterization or not, and it was not entirely fair to the early seasons, it was accurately aimed at the direction the show was heading. The later cutaways frequently could have been swapped out for other cutaways without affecting the episode in any way, because they were not connected to anything specific. They were interchangeable. The manatee critique had found its target. The most notorious example of cutaway excess in the show's history is the Conway Twitty gag, a recurring bit in which, instead of a joke, the show would simply air an unedited performance of country singer Conway Twitty singing one of his songs. Not a clip, not a reference. A full performance lasting several minutes with no punchline and no twist. The first time it appeared, it was genuinely surprising, and surprise can sometimes be funny even without a punchline attached. The second time it appeared, the surprise was gone. The third and fourth and fifth times it appeared, it became something that functioned more like a test of the audience's patience than anything recognizable as comedy. That test was, on some level, the point. The Conway Twitty gag was about nothing other than the show's willingness to take up your time without giving you anything in return, and to call that refusal to give you anything a kind of comedy. Some viewers genuinely found this funny. But for many others, and for the critics who paid attention to what the show was doing with this device, it read as a confession of indifference. The writers did not have enough material to fill the episode with actual jokes, and rather than solve that problem through work, they solved it through audacity. Or if not audacity, then something that looked enough like it from a distance. The physical comedy evolved in a related direction. In the early seasons, when Peter fell or bumped into something or got into a fight with a giant chicken, the comedy came from the cartoon logic of the situation. The exaggerated consequence, the immediate recovery, the way physical harm in animation can be funny precisely because of how different it is from physical harm in reality. The chicken fights were elaborate set pieces, yes, but they had energy and invention and the specific quality of something being made rather than simply assembled. You could feel someone had thought about them. In the later seasons, a gag that should have lasted 5 seconds would go on for 30 or 40 seconds or more. Peter hurting his knee would become a prolonged scene of just Peter making the same noise over and over, the sound itself becoming the joke, in the absence of anything funnier to fill the time. A cutaway about a character struggling with something ordinary in the kitchen would pass the 1-minute mark. The show seemed to have discovered that duration alone could simulate commitment, and that commitment could simulate comedy, at least for long enough to get to the next moment. The episode Back to the Pilot from the 10th season contained a genuinely funny meta-observation about the cutaway's effect on the show's characters. In it, Brian and Stewie travel back to the very first episode and observe the characters from the present day standing around awkwardly during a cutaway, waiting with nothing to do until it ends. It is a sharp joke. It acknowledges exactly what critics had been pointing out for years, that the cutaways took the characters out of the story and left them with nowhere to go while the gag ran its course. But the show could not be given too much credit for making this observation, because acknowledging a problem is not the same as solving it. And the episodes that followed Back to the Pilot continued to lean on cutaways as heavily as ever. The episode Cutaway Land, which came later, was the show's attempt to build an entire episode around its most famous device. Peter and Lois discover they can travel through the world of cutaways, visiting the scenes that had appeared in previous episodes. It used recycled material, which made it feel lazier than a normal episode rather than more self-aware. And it ended with Peter waking up and discovering the whole thing had been a dream. The dream ending is the oldest, most tired resolution in all of storytelling. It means nothing happened, nothing changed, nothing was at stake. It is the narrative equivalent of a reset button pressed with maximum efficiency and minimum imagination. The episode that was supposed to be the ultimate tribute to Family Guy's most distinctive comedic device ended up being a perfect illustration of everything that had gone wrong with it. The brightest exception to the cutaway problem in the show's middle and later seasons was the eighth season episode Brian and Stewie, in which the two characters are accidentally locked in a bank vault overnight and spend the entire episode simply talking to each other. No cutaways, no supplementary gags, just two characters in a room having conversations that were more honest than anything the show usually permitted itself. Brian reveals that he keeps a gun in a safety deposit box because there have been moments when he wanted to end his own life. Stewie reveals how completely he loves Brian and how lost he would be without him. It is raw and uncomfortable and more moving than you might expect from a show that had spent several seasons treating depth as optional. That episode exists as proof. Proof that when Family Guy chose to tell a story with nothing but its characters and their relationship, without the crutch of the cutaway to fill space, it could produce something extraordinary. The cutaway problem was never that the technique was bad, it was that the show became unable to survive without it, and then unwilling to try. Section 10. The promise of the episodes themselves. Beyond the characters, beyond the format, the early seasons of Family Guy made a promise with each episode they broadcast. The promise that the 22 minutes you were about to spend would be coherent, that they would be about something, that by the time the credits rolled, something would have happened, some small piece of story would have completed itself, and the characters you had spent time with would have moved from one state to another in a way that felt earned rather than arbitrary. The early episodes had structure. Not elaborate structure, not the kind of architectural complexity that prestige drama builds, but the simple, sufficient structure of a beginning, a middle, and an end that connected to the beginning in a meaningful way. An episode would introduce a situation, develop it through the specific qualities of the characters involved, and resolve it in a way that emerged organically from those qualities, rather than being imposed from outside. In The Thin White Line, from the end of the second season, Brian becomes a drug-sniffing dog for the police department and ends up developing a cocaine dependency. It is, on its face, a deeply silly premise, but the episode handles it with enough care that the comedy and the something that feels like feeling arrive together. Brian's addiction is played both for laughs and for something approaching genuine concern. His relationship with Peter, the one that grounds so much of the early show's emotional life, is strained and then mended in a way that feels like a real repair rather than a quick fix for the purposes of the episode. Brian Does Hollywood, which opened the third season and continued the story from The Thin White Line, sent Brian to Los Angeles to pursue his writing career and found him working in the adult film industry instead. It is funnier than a summary makes it sound, and it has the particular quality of the show's best early work. A genuine insight about a human situation dressed in the most absurd possible clothing. The insight here is about the gap between what we aspire to and what we settle for, and how those two things can coexist in the same life without either canceling out the other. In Da Bomb, from the end of the first season, the Griffin family survives a fictional Y2K apocalypse that turns out to be all too real in this version of events. And the episode becomes a post-apocalyptic survival story that manages to say something about what people value when they are stripped of everything normal. That is not an obvious thing for an animated comedy to do. It requires the writers to actually believe that the characters are worth exploring, that they have interior lives complex enough to be tested. These are just examples. The early seasons are full of them. Yeah, episodes that had a genuine point of view, that were building towards something, that knew what they were trying to do and executed it with enough craft that the audience felt the intention, even when the comedy was taking them somewhere unexpected. The later seasons lost this. Not completely and not all at once, but the loss was real and cumulative. As the cutaways expanded to fill more and more of each episode's running time, the stories contracted. Plots that should have had 3 acts were compressed into 1.5, with the remaining time distributed among gags that were more or less connected to the main through line depending on the week. Characters made decisions that existed to generate a scene rather than to develop a story. Episodes ended not with resolution, but with cessation, the plot simply stopping when the 22 minutes had elapsed, rather than reaching a genuine conclusion. The show had moments in the later seasons that recaptured what the early episodes had promised. The road episodes, in particular, continued to be a space where the writing had to meet a higher standard, where the Brian and Stewie dynamic demanded genuine craft because the audience had been trained to expect it. Road to the Multiverse, which opened the 8th season, was greeted with genuine enthusiasm and drew an audience of more than 10 million viewers, the highest rating for the 8th season, which suggests that the promise of quality was still capable of drawing the old audience back when it was actually being honored. But those exceptions only sharpened the contrast with the average episode, which had become significantly less interested in earning the attention it was asking for. The early show treated every episode as an opportunity. The later show treated most episodes as obligations. Section 11. The promise of Seth MacFarlane. Every show is, at some level, the expression of a person's sensibility. Not just a single person in most cases, because television is too collaborative a medium for any individual to exert total control, but a central sensibility that guides the ship, that determines what the show cares about and what it is willing to let go, that recognizes when something is working and when it is not, that protects the thing that makes the show worth making. For Family Guy, that person was Seth MacFarlane. His involvement in the early seasons was not incidental. He was not a creator in name only, while other people made the actual decisions. He was in the room. He was writing. He was directing. He was voicing 4 of the show's main characters, Peter and Brian and Stewie and Quagmire, which meant that his voice, literally and figuratively, was present in the show from 4 different angles simultaneously. He had opinions about the jokes, the bait. He had opinions about the characters. He had a specific point of view that ran through every episode he was closely involved with, a sensibility that balanced absurdism and a genuine feeling, with a precision that not everyone who worked on the show possessed or perhaps could possess, because sensibilities are not transferable. In his September 2017 AMA on Reddit, MacFarlane revealed that he had not written for the show since 2010, choosing instead to focus on production and voice acting. That sentence, read carefully, is one of the most important pieces of information available about why Family Guy declined when it did, and as it did. He stopped writing in 2010, Season 9 premiered in 2010. Analysts and fans and critics who have tried to identify the point at which the show's decline became irreversible consistently point to the period between Seasons 8 and 10. The timeline is not a coincidence. MacFarlane's other projects during this period tell a story of a creative person whose ambitions had expanded well beyond the show that made him famous, and who is pursuing those ambitions with the full force of his talent. The 2012 film Ted, which he wrote, directed, produced, and starred in, earned over $500 million dollars worldwide. A Million Ways to Die in the West followed in 2014. Ted 2 in 2015. The Orville, a science fiction television series that premiered in 2017 on Fox and later moved to Hulu, became a critical success and a genuine expression of McFarlane's love for the science fiction of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. He produced a Ted prequel series for Peacock. He released multiple albums of big band and jazz standards. He hosted the Academy Awards in 2013. He was one of the busiest people in American entertainment. And Family Guy was one commitment among many rather than the central project of his creative life. There is nothing wrong with any of that. A person who has built something remarkable has the right to build other things. McFarlane's talent was always larger than any single show, and watching him apply it to the Orville in particular, where his affection for the material is so visible in every frame, is a pleasure. But the question is not whether McFarlane was right to pursue other things. The question is what Family Guy lost when he stepped back. And the answer is the quality control that a creator provides when they care about something, enough to protect it from the natural pull of entropy that afflicts any long-running creative project. Showrunners Rich Appel and Alex Sulkin, who took over the day-to-day management of the show, have spoken openly about the change in McFarlane's involvement. In interviews, Sulkin noted that when McFarlane was always in the room, it was fantastic because he could speak in all the characters' dialogue effortlessly, could write in their voices without needing to warm up or recalibrate. That effortlessness, that quality of a show being made by the person who invented it, and therefore who understands it at the cellular level rather than the intellectual level, is not something that can be replicated by other people no matter how talented they are. A showrunner who has inherited a show makes different choices than the person who built it from scratch. This is inevitable and not a criticism of Appel and Sulkin, both of whom clearly care about the work, and have maintained a level of craft that kept the show functional long after lesser productions would have fully collapsed. But there's a difference between a caretaker's care and a creator's care. A caretaker maintains, a creator makes. Family Guy needed both for different things, and for most of its later life has had only the first. McFarlane's relationship with Fox became another complicating factor. In 2021, he posted publicly on social media that Fox News host Tucker Carlson's commentary made him wish Family Guy was on any other network. He compared his relationship with Fox to a failing marriage, saying the two sides both knew it was not working anymore. This was not a private frustration. This was the creator of one of Fox's longest-running shows publicly stating that he wanted out. The creative passion that had driven the show in its early years, the energy that McFarlane himself described as no sleep and no life, just drawing like crazy in his kitchen, had long since been replaced by something closer to obligation. In 2020, McFarlane signed a 5-year deal with NBC Universal, reportedly worth around $200 million, moving his production company away from the Fox ecosystem entirely. His newer projects were being made for platforms with no connection to the network where Family Guy lived. He was building his future elsewhere, and the show he had created was the thing keeping him tied to a network he had publicly expressed his desire to leave. And yet the show continued. In April 2025, it was announced that Family Guy had secured a 4-season renewal with parent company Disney, which had acquired Fox's entertainment assets. The show would run through at least the 2028 to 2029 television season, coinciding with the show's 30th anniversary. Each season would consist of 15 episodes. Family Guy was not just surviving, it was being guaranteed years of additional existence by a company that understood its value not as a piece of creative expression, but as a content property with enormous reach across streaming, syndication, merchandise, and licensing. That is the current reality of Family Guy. A show that continues to exist because it is cost effective to produce, because it has decades of catalog value on streaming platforms, because it still generates enough audience and enough revenue to justify its continuation in purely financial terms. Not because its creator has stories he is desperate to tell, not because the writers are operating at a level that demands the audience's attention, not because anyone involved is making it out of the kind of passionate conviction that produced those first 3 seasons. The numbers tell this story with merciless clarity. The show that debuted to 22 million viewers in 1999 was averaging 723,000 viewers by its 23rd season. That is not a rounding error. That is more than 95% of the original audience gone. The show was moved from Sunday nights, where it had been a flagship of Fox's animation domination lineup, to Wednesday nights beginning with the 2023 to 2024 broadcast season. Wednesday night is where television shows go when the network has decided they are no longer headliners. It is the schedule equivalent of a demotion, and it was the first time Family Guy had aired on a weekday since its original troubled run before the first cancellation in 2002. The promise that Seth MacFarlane made when he pitched that 15-minute pilot to Fox in May of 1998 was the promise of a creator's commitment. The promise of someone who had spent 6 months with no sleep and no life doing the thing he needed to do because the thing he needed to do was make this show. That kind of commitment cannot be sustained forever. No one would ask it to be. But the show could feel it when it was present, and the show could feel it when it was gone. Section 12. What could have been? Let us end where these things always deserve to end. Not with what was lost, but with what was possible. Not with the grief, though the grief is real and has earned its place in this conversation, but with the beauty of the thing that existed before the loss. With the thing itself, in all its strange and original and a genuinely funny and genuinely warm early life. Because the first 3 seasons of Family Guy were remarkable. Not just good, not just worth watching. Remarkable in the specific way that things are remarkable when they come into existence with a clarity of vision and a willingness to be exactly themselves, without apology and without imitation. The show did not try to be The Simpsons. It did not try to be South Park. It was doing something that had not quite been done before in a voice that belonged to no one else, with characters that were instantly and completely themselves. Peter Griffin in those early seasons was funny in the way that a funhouse mirror is funny. He reflected something recognizable about a specific kind of American masculinity, that loud, impulsive, sentimental working class variety, and made it both larger and somehow more clearly itself through the distortion. He was funny because he was real, and he was real because someone had observed him carefully before drawing him. Brian was funny because he was the thing we all secretly believe we are in our best moments. The one who sees clearly and speaks honestly and has actually read the books he references. And the comedy came from the gap between that self-image and the reality of a dog who was drinking too much and could not finish his novel and kept falling for the wrong people. He was funny the way that recognition is funny, the way that seeing yourself in a character who is both more ridiculous and more sympathetic than you expected is always a little funny and a little moving simultaneously. Stewie was funny because he was the impossible made mundane, the most extreme possible secret hidden in the most ordinary possible container. And the show played the contrast with absolute commitment and no wink to the audience. Meg was real in a way that mattered. The ordinary girl in the extraordinary family. The one who wanted things that were simple enough to be universal and was consistently denied them by the chaos around her. There was a story there, a real and potentially moving story, about what it means to be seen in a world that keeps looking past you. Lois was the quiet center of gravity that made everything else possible. The person whose love for this messy, loud, fundamentally difficult family gave the audience permission to love them too. And Chris, with his father's face and his different potential, was a quiet promise about what might happen if the cycle broke. The show that those characters lived in was built with real craft. The jokes were specific. The stories had structure. The world felt inhabited. The cutaways were deployed with restraint and with purpose, tools in the service of something larger rather than the whole point of the exercise. All of that was real. All of that existed. And all of that was, for a while, one of the most distinctive and enjoyable things on television. The things that came later, the flanderized characters, the cutaway overload, the mean-spirited treatment of Meg, the abandonment of the careful storytelling in favor of shock and spectacle and the appearance of effort. Rather than effort itself, those things were choices, not inevitable consequences of longevity, not the unavoidable result of a show running too long. American Dad, created by the same person on the same network at the same time, proves the point conclusively. American Dad ran for roughly the same number of seasons as the post-revival Family Guy on roughly the same budgets, with roughly the same resources, and maintained a quality and a consistency that Family Guy increasingly lost. The choices made by the people running American Dad were different choices, better choices, choices that protected the characters and the stories and the warmth. The existence of American Dad as a continuing, functional, genuinely good animated comedy is the most powerful argument available that Family Guy's decline was not fated. It was chosen. The saddest version of the story is not the one where the show got worse. Long-running shows often get worse. That is almost a law of television, rather than an exception to it. The saddest version is the one where you can see so clearly what the show might have remained if the people making it had kept caring the way the people who built it originally cared. If MacFarlane had stayed in the room, if the writers had resisted the easy path of cutaway dependency and kept finding ways to make the characters carry the weight, if Peter had been allowed to keep his warmth, if Brian had been held to the standard of his own intelligence, if Stewie had been trusted to remain dangerous, if Meg had been allowed to become the character she was always promising to be. None of those things required some extraordinary act of creative heroism. They required maintenance. They required the ordinary, unglamorous work of continuing to care about something beyond the point where caring becomes difficult. They required someone in the room who could look at a script and say, "This is not us. This is not the show. We can do better than this." They required, in other words, what every long-running creative project requires: sustained commitment from the people responsible for it. That commitment existed in the beginning. It produced something worth loving, and then, piece by piece and season by season, it eroded, and the show became a function of its own past, rather than a continuation of its best qualities. The golden years, as the transcript this video's structure was inspired by calls them, are still there. Seasons 1 through 3 are preserved and available, and they are still exactly what they always were: sharp and funny and warm and strange in all the right ways. They are the proof that it was real, that the promise was real, that the show that made it was genuinely capable of the things it promised. That is worth something. It is worth a great deal. And it is worth remembering tonight or this morning or whatever quiet hour finds you here, that the thing that was loved was real even when what replaced it was not. The promise Family Guy made in 1999 was made in good faith. It was made by a 25-year-old with no sleep and no life, and a kitchen table full of sketches and a head full of characters who were already completely themselves. It was made honestly. And for a few years, it was honored. What happened after that is the rest of the story, and the rest of the story is complicated and human and familiar in the specific way that stories about things being allowed to slip away are always familiar. We have all watched something we loved change into something we barely recognized. We have all felt that particular grief. The show made a lot of promises, and the ones it kept beautifully. That is enough to hold on to. If this video found you somewhere quiet tonight, if it kept you company through the hours when the world goes still, then it has done what it was made to do. There is something about settling into a long story about something you loved, even if part of that story is about loss, that feels like keeping faith with the thing itself. Remembering it clearly, not letting it go entirely. If you want to keep coming back to this channel, a subscription is the simplest way to do that, and it genuinely means everything to the growth of what we are building here. If something in this video landed for you, leave a comment. Tell me where you are watching from and what the early seasons meant to you. Tell me your favorite episode from seasons 1 through 3. Tell me which character you miss the most. And if you need somewhere to put the grief for a show that started with so much promise, well, that is what this channel is for. Take care of yourselves. Sleep well. Total estimated word count, 31,200 plus words. Section 13, The Promise of the Friendships. One of the most underappreciated losses in the story of Family Guy's decline is the loss of its friendship dynamics. The show is built at its foundation on a series of specific and carefully observed relationships between specific and carefully observed people, and those relationships were as much the point of the show as any individual joke or cutaway or character moment. Peter and Brian. That was the core of it. The working class man who had no use for intellectual pretension and the intellectual who had no patience for willful ignorance, thrown together by circumstance into a relationship that should not have worked and worked completely. The comedy of their early dynamic was not the comedy of a straight man and a fool. It was the comedy of two people who were both kind of right and kind of wrong, who each had things to teach the other and were almost entirely unable to learn them, and who remained friends anyway because that is what real friendships often look like. Brian was not Peter's babysitter. He was not the wise counselor dispensing wisdom to the man-child. He was a deeply flawed person in his own right, a person whose intelligence was real but whose judgment was frequently just as poor as Peter's in different ways, and their friendship worked precisely because neither of them held the moral high ground for very long. They were two people who genuinely liked each other and were each completely incapable of being what the other needed, and they made it work through sheer stubbornness and affection. In the early seasons, you can feel this dynamic operating in individual scenes. Peter would do something reckless, and Brian would call it out, and Peter would ignore him, and then the thing would go wrong the way Brian had said it would, and the conversation that followed would not be a victory for Brian because Brian was not the winner of those scenes. He was just the person who happened to be right this time, which is different. The show understood the difference. It understood that being right about something does not automatically make you a better person or a better friend. It just makes you right about that thing. The later seasons lost this understanding. Peter and Brian's friendship became less a relationship between two specific people and more a structural convenience, a reason for them to be in the same scenes together. The scenes that should have carried the weight of their history were written without reference to that history. Brian would say something sharp to Peter, and Peter would not seem to fully register who was saying it. The intimacy that comes from years of knowing someone, the specific ways you speak to them because you know which words land and which ones don't, because you have had the same argument enough times to know where it goes. That intimacy was absent. The friendship between Peter and his bar companions, Joe and Quagmire and Cleveland, had a similar arc. In the early seasons, the dynamic between these four men had a warmth and a specificity that came from someone having actually thought about what it would feel like to be these particular people spending time together in this particular place. The Drunken Clam was not just a generic bar set. It was a specific location with specific associations, where these specific men had their specific conversations and their specific arguments and their specific rituals. You believed in the friendship because the show had done the work of building it. As the seasons went on and the characters became broader versions of themselves, the friendships followed. Joe went from being the man everyone respected to being the man everyone either pitied or mocked. Cleveland's gentleness, which had been the quality that made him interesting in contrast to the louder personalities around him, became a joke at its own expense. Quagmire's transgressive appetites, which had always walked the line between uncomfortable and funny, started falling more often on the wrong side of it. The drunken clam scenes in the later seasons often felt like four people waiting for the scene to end, rather than four people having a conversation. The rhythm was off. The history was absent. The specific, organic way that old friends talk to each other, the way they can be insulting, because the affection underneath is assumed and does not need to be stated. The way they can fall silent without it being awkward, because silence between people who know each other well is a different kind of silence than silence between strangers. All of that was gone. What replaced it was efficiency, scenes that set up the next plot point, that delivered the required exposition that got the characters from A to B and on to the cutaway that would carry the comedic weight the scene itself was no longer able to carry. It worked, in the narrow sense that the episode continued to function, but it did not feel like anything. It did not feel like four friends at a bar. It felt like four actors on a set waiting for the director to call cut. The promise of Family Guy's friendships was a world full of relationships that felt lived in and specific and real. A promise that when these characters interacted with each other, you would believe in the history between them, the years of knowing each other that did not fit on screen, but were implied by every scene. That promise was beautifully kept in the early seasons, and gradually, almost entirely relinquished in the later ones. Section 14. The promise of the humor. Family Guy at its best was genuinely funny. Not funny in the way that something is funny when it is loud enough or fast enough or shocking enough to produce a reflexive reaction. Funny in the deeper sense, the sense where the laugh comes from a place of recognition or surprise, or the particular delight of a joke that arrives from an unexpected direction and then makes perfect retroactive sense. The early show had a specific comic sensibility that is harder to describe than it is to recognize. It was irreverent without being careless. It was dark without being nihilistic. It was willing to go to uncomfortable places because it trusted its own intelligence to know what to do once it got there. The offensive material had a point. The shock served the comedy rather than substituting for it. Even the most outrageous moments in those early seasons had a logic to them, a reason beyond the shock itself. The cutaway jokes in those early seasons demonstrate this quality clearly. The best of them were not simply random. They were specific connections between what a character had just said and an image that illuminated it from an unexpected angle. The humor came from the quality of the connection, from the specificity of the choice, from the sense that someone had thought carefully about the relationship between the setup and the payoff. The image was chosen because it was the right image for that moment, not because it happened to be funny enough to fill the time. The early seasons also had a command of timing that the later seasons frequently lost. Comedy is almost entirely about timing, about the length of a pause and the placement of a punchline and the speed at which you move through a scene. In those first 3 seasons, the timing in Family Guy was consistently precise. The show knew when to cut away and when not to. It knew when to linger on a moment and when to get out of a scene before the joke had a chance to curdle. That knowledge is not accidental. It is the product of a room full of people who are skilled at what they do, and who are also being guided by someone who can feel the difference between a joke that is landing and one that has started to tip over. McFarlane's background in animation and radio comedy gave him a specific sensitivity to the rhythm of humor that is different from the sensitivity you develop writing for live action television. Radio comedy, in particular, is about timing in its purest form, because without the visual element, you have nothing but the tempo and the pitch and the pause to work with. The early show's sense of rhythm reflects that background. It trusts silence. It trusts the pause before the punchline. It does not rush to reassure the audience that a joke is coming. The later seasons increasingly did rush. The pace accelerated in ways that felt less like confidence and more like anxiety. Moments that should have been allowed to breathe were filled immediately with the next moment. Jokes that needed space to develop were compressed into their quickest possible version. The show seemed to have developed a fear of the audience's attention wandering, which caused it to keep moving so fast that the audience never had time to actually feel anything. And comedy, real comedy, the kind that leaves a mark rather than just producing a noise, requires the audience to feel something. The shift from clever to shock-based humor followed a predictable curve. In the early seasons, a joke about a sensitive topic would have three layers: the setup, which established the context, the shocking element, which created the initial reaction, and the punchline, which recontextualized the shocking element and delivered the actual comedic payoff. All three layers were necessary. The shock without the punchline was not a joke. It was just shock. In the later seasons, the third layer increasingly disappeared. The setup and the shocking element remained, but the punchline, the thing that transformed the discomfort into comedy, was absent. What remained was just the discomfort, offered as its own end, as though the audience's discomfort was the point, rather than a means to a point. This is not a subtle distinction, and it is not a matter of taste. It is a technical distinction about what comedy is and what it is not. A joke has a point. A shock does not require one. The early show knew this. The later show sometimes forgot it. The musical numbers, which were one of the show's more distinctive features, maintained their quality longer than most elements. McFarlane's genuine love for big band music and the musical theater tradition gave the show's songs a craftsmanship that did not depend on whoever happened to be writing the surrounding episode. Songs like Christmas Time is Killing Us from Road to the North Pole, or the various numbers in the Road to episodes demonstrated that the show could still produce material of genuine quality when it was working in a mode that demanded it. That the musical numbers held up while other elements declined is actually quite telling. The musical numbers required a specific discipline. They required melody and meter and rhyme, all of which imposed structural constraints that kept the content from becoming too loose or too easy. The cutaway gags had no such constraints. The dialogue scenes had no such constraints. The shock value moments had no such constraints. Comedy without structural constraints does what anything without constraints does. It expands to fill whatever space it is given, and not always wisely. The promise of Family Guy's humor was a particular kind of comedy that was both distinctive and consistently good. Not every joke would land, no show manages that. But the average quality would be high enough that an episode could reliably deliver the kind of laughs that left you wanting to watch again because you trusted that the next one would be worth your time. That trust was built carefully in the early seasons, and it was eroded just as carefully in the later ones. Section 15. The Promise of the World. A show's world is not just its setting. A show's world is the totality of all the implied things, all the things that exist just beyond the edge of the frame, all the history and geography and interpersonal texture that the episodes exist within but can never fully show. A world that feels real has depth that the camera does not reach. Characters have lives that continue when they are not on screen. Locations have histories that exist beyond what any single episode requires them to have. In the early seasons of Family Guy, the show's world had this kind of depth. The fictional Rhode Island town felt like a real place, not because it was naturalistic or detailed in the way that some dramas work to be detailed, but because the show had populated it with enough specificity to imply that more existed. The Drunken Clam had regulars who were not the main characters. The neighborhood had a history. The high school that Meg and Chris attended had a social ecosystem that the show occasionally explored and then wisely left mostly unexplored, because the unexplored parts were part of what made it feel real. The various supporting characters who populated the edges of the show added to this texture. Herbert, the old man who was deeply inappropriate in his affection for Chris, represented a kind of comedy that the early show could manage because it trusted the audience to understand what was being satirized without having to make the satire explicit. Dr. Hartman, the family doctor, Mort Goldman, the pharmacist, Mayor Adam West, played with cheerful and genuine absurdism by the actual Adam West, whose death in 2017 left a specific hole in the show that was never quite filled. The world had its own specific geography of comedy. Cleveland's bathtub falling out of his house whenever something happened nearby became a running joke that worked, because it was so carefully established in its physical logic that each new instance felt like a return to something known rather than a repetition of something tired. The giant chicken fights worked on a similar principle, an absurd premise locked in from the beginning and then revisited with increasing elaborateness and care. The show's relationship with pop culture was another element of the world building that worked differently in the early seasons than in the later ones. In the early seasons, the pop culture references were specific and often unexpected. They were not simply current events or famous names dropped to signal the show's awareness of what was happening in the world. They were genuine engagements with specific cultural artifacts, specific films or television shows, or music that meant something to the people making the show. And that meaning was part of what made the reference land. In the later seasons, the pop culture references became more like inventory management. Things that were currently in the culture were cataloged and referenced, regardless of whether they had any particular resonance with the show's sensibility or the characters' histories. The result was a show that felt topical without feeling engaged, that was aware of the world without having anything particularly interesting to say about it. The world of later Family Guy also contracted in a way that was difficult to fully articulate but consistently felt. The implied spaces became less implied. The characters' lives outside the immediate plot of any given episode became less present. The town itself became less specific, more generic, a functional backdrop for whatever scene needed to happen rather than a place with its own character and history. Part of this contraction was a natural consequence of the cutaway dependency. When you are filling a substantial portion of each episode with disconnected gags, there is less time for the material that builds a sense of place and continuity. The cutaways, by their nature, took the show out of its world and into a series of disconnected moments. Each time it returned to the main story, it had to reestablish the world from scratch, because the cutaway had not taken place in the world and therefore had not contributed to it. The promise of Family Guy's world was a place you wanted to spend time in. Not because it was comfortable or safe, it was neither, but because it felt alive and specific and worth exploring. That promise was fully honored in the early seasons and gradually abandoned as the show prioritized the quick comedic hit over the slower pleasure of a world that rewards your sustained attention. Section 16. The Promise of American Dad as Mirror. The existence of American Dad as a successful, long-running, critically appreciated animated comedy is not a footnote to the story of Family Guy's decline. It is a central piece of evidence in the argument that the decline was not inevitable. American Dad premiered on February 6th, 2005, just months before Family Guy returned from cancellation for its fourth season. It was created by Seth MacFarlane, along with Mike Barker and Matt Weitzman. The show followed the Smith family in Langley Falls, Virginia. Stan Smith, a deeply patriotic CIA operative, his wife Francine, their daughter Haley, who embodied the liberal politics that Stan consistently found incomprehensible, their son Steve, an insecure teenager navigating adolescence with more optimism than competence. Roger, an alien who had been living in their attic since the government captured him decades ago. And Klaus, a German speaking goldfish who was actually a man whose brain had been placed into a fish's body by the CIA as punishment. The premise sounds, on its face, like a more elaborate version of Family Guy's own premise: a dysfunctional household with extreme elements built around an overbearing patriarch in a suburban setting that the show would use as a backdrop for whatever absurdity it chose to generate that week. Many people dismissed it immediately as exactly that, a pale imitation, a lesser version. The second of two Seth MacFarlane shows that would obviously stand in the shadow of the more famous one. They were wrong. American Dad got better. Consistently, measurably, specifically better. While Family Guy was going through the various changes discussed throughout this video, while its characters were being stripped of the qualities that made them interesting, and its stories were being replaced by collections of disconnected gags, American Dad was doing the opposite. It was developing, it was finding itself, it was becoming the show it had only gestured toward in its first season. The key structural difference, and it is a significant one, is that American Dad does not use cutaway gags. The humor in American Dad must come from the characters and the situations, from the story that the episode is telling, from the specific dynamics between the specific people in the room. The writers cannot reach for the supplementary gag when the scene is not quite working. They have to fix the scene. That constraint, which might seem like a limitation, is actually the source of the show's consistency. It forces the writing to be better. Stan Smith's character development is worth examining in detail as a contrast to Peter Griffin's. Stan began as an extreme caricature of conservative American masculinity, which gave him less room to grow than Peter had, because Peter was at least a version of something that could be recognized and related to without the caricature getting in the way. Stan was more of a type than a person in his first season, but the writers worked with what they had and they were patient about it. Over the following seasons, Stan became complicated. Not soft, not rehabilitated into a different kind of person, but complicated, in the specific way that real people are complicated. Capable of being wrong in ways that had genuine consequences. Capable of learning things even when learning was difficult and slow and accompanied by regression. His relationship with Haley, built on a political and generational divide that would have been impossible to bridge in real life, became one of the show's most consistently interesting dynamics, precisely because the show refused to pretend the divide was bridgeable when it was not, and refused to pretend it was unbridgeable when occasional moments of genuine connection broke through it. Roger the Alien became one of the great characters in animated television, by way of a concept that could not have existed in any live-action format. The ability to adopt entirely different personas, different names, different stories, different personalities, with a complete commitment that made each persona feel like a real character rather than a costume. The show could have a story about a lounge singer named Ricky Spanish. It could have a story about a Southern belle named Linda Mamari. It could have a story about a crime boss named Tearjerker. All of these were Roger, and all of them were genuinely and distinctively funny. And the concept never got stale because the concept was designed for infinite variation. Compare this to what happened with Stewie. Roger and Stewie are, in structural terms, doing similar work in their respective shows. They are the characters who break the reality of the world most completely, who exist at the largest remove from ordinary human psychology, who have the most obvious latitude to be whatever the episode needs them to be. The difference is that the writers of American Dad leaned into Roger's structural flexibility and used it to generate genuinely new material season after season, while the writers of Family Guy used Stewie's similarly extreme premise as a reason to simplify him rather than complexify him. Francine Smith avoided the Flanderization that destroyed Lois Griffin. Haley and Steve maintained consistent personalities across the show's run. The friendship between Stan and Roger, unlikely and perpetually uneasy, had the quality of real friendship between two people who should not get along and cannot quite manage to stop. American Dad also handled its network transition gracefully. When Fox moved the show to TBS after its 11th season, which could easily have been the end of it, the writers and the production team treated the move as an opportunity. The show continued to produce quality episodes on the new network, and in some respects, the additional creative freedom of cable television allowed it to take risks that broadcast television might have constrained. The contrast between what happened to Family Guy and what happened to American Dad demolishes the most common defense offered for the former's decline, which is simply that any show this old must decline, that creative fatigue is inevitable, that 20 plus seasons is just too many for any comedy to maintain quality. American Dad is the same age. It has faced the same creative pressures. It has operated with the same resources, the same basic production model, the same network pressures, and in the same broader cultural environment. And it has remained a good show, not a perfect show, not without its own inconsistencies and occasional failures of nerve, but a good show. A show worth watching. A show that has not abandoned its best qualities in the pursuit of easier ones. The promise that American Dad makes and keeps is the same promise that Family Guy made and broke. The promise that the characters will be allowed to be themselves, that the stories will be worth telling, that the humor will come from something rather than simply being loud enough to seem like it is coming from something. American Dad kept that promise. Family Guy did not. And the gap between those two outcomes is not a gap in talent or resources. It is a gap in choices. That is the final thing worth saying about Family Guy's decline, the thing that the American Dad comparison makes unavoidable. It was chosen. Every one of the specific failures discussed in this video was a specific choice. The decision to push Peter into cruelty. The decision to turn Brian into a fraud. The decision to retire the evil genius in Stewie. The decision to reduce Meg to a function rather than developing her as a character. The decision to let the cutaways consume the episodes. The decision to replace cleverness with shock. The decision to keep the show running after its creator had moved on and its creative energy had been redirected elsewhere. None of these things had to happen. Each of them could have gone differently. The show that Family Guy could have been, maintained at the level of its best moments across a longer run, is a show that would have been genuinely remarkable. It would have been, arguably, one of the great achievements of American animated comedy. Instead, it became something else. Something that trades on the memory of what it was. Something that has its good days and its terrible ones, and whose best moments remind you of what it used to promise more than they deliver that promise themselves. The early seasons are still there. They are still exactly what they were. They are still the proof that the promise was real, that the thing people loved was worth loving, that the grief over its loss is grief over something genuine. Hold on to those early seasons. Watch them when you need to remember what was possible. They are the versions of Peter and Brian and Stewie and Meg and Lois and Chris that were made with the kind of attention and care and love that you can feel through a screen. They are the show being itself most fully. The promises they made were real. The grief that they were not kept is real. Both of those things can be true at the same time. And sitting with both of them in the quiet of a late night or an early morning is maybe the most honest thing you can do with a show that started as beautifully as Family Guy did. Section 17, Final Thoughts for the Night. It is late or it is early, depending on where you are sitting right now. Maybe you are lying in bed with headphones in, the room dark, the rest of the house quiet. Maybe you are on a couch with a blanket pulled up and nothing in particular that needs doing for the next few hours. Maybe you are somewhere else entirely, some pocket of stillness you have found in the middle of a world that does not stop moving very often. This video has been a long one. We covered a lot of ground. We spent time with 6 characters and the promises each of them made, and what happened to each of those promises across 20-plus seasons of television. We looked at the humor and the world building and the structural choices and the creative decisions that accumulated, season by season, into something that looked like decline and was also always the shadow of something that had been genuinely good. There is a particular peace in talking about things you love, even when the talking is partly about grief. The love is still there underneath the grief. The grief would not exist without the love. And the love would not have been possible without the thing itself, without those early seasons of a cartoon that was made by a 25-year-old with no sleep and no life, and a head full of specific, original, fully realized characters who arrived on television screens on Super Bowl Sunday in 1999, and immediately made 22 million people feel like they had found something worth staying up for. You can still find that thing. It is there in the episodes. It has not gone anywhere. The promises it made are still audible in every scene of every episode from those first 3 seasons, and in the best scenes of the seasons that followed. The show at its best was something worth loving. The fact that it did not stay at its best does not erase that. If you have made it to the end of this video, you have either fallen asleep somewhere in the middle of it, which is exactly what this channel is here for, or you have been listening the whole way through, which means you care about this stuff the way I care about it. Either way, thank you. If this is the kind of video you come back to, there is a subscribe button down there, and it takes 1 tap. It matters more than you know. And if something in this video made you feel something, leave a comment. Tell me which character you missed the most. Tell me your favorite early episode. Tell me about the first time you watched Family Guy and what it meant to you. Sleep well. You have earned it. Script complete. Approximate word count. 31,000 plus words. Section 18. The promise of the pilot. Let us talk about the pilot again because the pilot deserves more than a mention in the opening section. The pilot is the complete statement of everything the show was promising, compressed into its most concentrated possible form. And going back to it now, knowing everything that came after, is one of the more instructive exercises available to someone trying to understand what Family Guy was before it became what it is. The first episode, Death Has a Shadow, was written by MacFarlane himself and directed by Peter Shin. The premise is relatively simple by the standards of what animated comedies would eventually do with their pilot episodes. Peter loses his job at the toy factory after falling asleep during work following a night of heavy drinking with his friends. He applies for welfare to hide this from Lois. He receives a welfare check made out for far too much money through a clerical error, and instead of returning the excess, spends it. Lois finds out. Peter has to make it right. That is the plot. What is interesting is not the plot. What is interesting is how the show chooses to frame every beat of that plot. what it decides to show you about these characters before you have learned to love them, what impression it is trying to make in the very first episode of what it clearly hopes will be a long run. The choice to begin with Peter's flaw, his impulsiveness, his inability to resist a night out even when the responsible thing is obvious, is revealing. The show is not hiding who Peter is. It is establishing who Peter is immediately because it trusts that the audience will like him anyway. That confidence is rare in a pilot. Most pilots spend their early minutes trying to make the main character as likable as possible before introducing their flaws, to build goodwill before asking the audience to extend charity. Family Guy does not do this. It shows you Peter at his worst, or at least at a representative worst, and trusts that what comes after will make the case for why you should care about him. What comes after is Lois. Lois discovering what Peter has done and being genuinely hurt by it. Not in a cartoonish, played-for-laughs way, but in a way that registers as real. Alex Borstein's vocal performance in that first episode has a quality that the scripts did not always give her latitude to access in the later years. Genuine disappointment, genuine concern, genuine love that is being tested rather than simply asserted. And then there is the resolution, which involves Peter dropping the remaining welfare money from a blimp over a stadium full of people, which leads to a riot and his arrest. It is an absurd ending, fully committing to the show's willingness to let the consequences of a bad decision escalate beyond all reasonable proportion. But what follows the absurdity is the moment that matters. Peter sitting in a holding cell having done something genuinely foolish that has hurt people he loves and embarrassed himself completely, and Lois coming to get him, not because he deserves it, but because he is her husband and she loves him. And that love is not conditional on his judgment being good. That final image, or the spirit of it, is the entire promise of the show compressed into a single moment. This is a family. They are going to mess up. They are going to mess up in big, loud, spectacular ways, and they are going to love each other anyway, through the mess and in spite of it. Come back next week, and we will do it again. 22 million people got that promise in 1999, and they believed in it. They believed in it enough to find the show again on Adult Swim 3 years after it was canceled. They believed in it enough to buy the DVD sets. They believed in it enough to write letters to Fox demanding that the show be brought back. They believed in it because the promise was made honestly and in good faith and delivered on with complete commitment in that first episode and in the ones that followed. The pilot also introduced Brian in a scene that captures everything about early Brian in about 30 seconds. Peter comes home drunk and Brian is waiting up for him. Not in a parental or accusatory way, just waiting. Because that is what Brian does. He is the one who notices when Peter has not come home yet. He is the one who is awake when everyone else is asleep. He offers Peter water and says something dry and affectionate that makes it clear he is both amused by and fond of this ridiculous man he lives with. In 30 seconds, the show has told you who Brian is and what his relationship with Peter is, and why you should be glad these two characters exist. Stewie appears in the pilot in full villain mode, building a machine in his room, delivering a monologue about his plans that is interrupted by Lois calling him for dinner. He abandons the monologue mid-sentence to go eat because whatever his ambitions may be, he is still a baby and dinner is dinner. That joke, the gap between his enormous pretensions and his tiny, baby-sized reality, is the whole character in one image. Meg barely appears in the pilot, which is fitting. She would become more prominent in the episodes that followed, but in the pilot she is mostly a presence in the background, the ordinary teenager who has not yet distinguished herself from the chaos around her. That restraint, the choice not to immediately establish every character fully, but to allow some of them to arrive gradually, shows a confidence in the audience's patience that the later seasons would entirely lose. Chris is similarly restrained in his pilot appearance, which is also fitting. He would develop his own specific qualities in subsequent episodes. For now, he is the round-faced boy who looks like his father and has the same slightly too slow response time to things. That is enough for a pilot. The writing in the pilot has the quality that the best early episodes consistently have. It never tries too hard. The jokes arrive at a natural pace. The emotional moments are not underlined. The setup and payoff structure is efficient without being mechanical. There is a confidence to the whole thing, the confidence of a creative team that knows what it is doing and trusts the material to make its case without being oversold. McFarlane's Reddit. AM. A comment that he had not written for the show since 2010 lands differently when you have been watching the pilot. The pilot is written by the same man who would stop writing for the show 11 years later, but you can feel in it the specific quality of something being made by someone for whom the stakes are personal. The characters are this man's invention. The world is this man's creation. The jokes reflect this man's specific sense of humor, his love of radio drama and old movies and big band music, and the particular kind of comedy that rewards a certain kind of attention. The pilot is not just the beginning of a show, it is the introduction of a sensibility, a creative mind in its full and undiluted expression, before the compromises of success and schedule and the diminishing creative ownership that comes with a long run had accumulated. That sensibility did not disappear when McFarlane stopped writing. It lingered in the show, audible in the performances, occasionally surfacing in episodes that happened to be produced by someone who had internalized it enough to reproduce it. But it was no longer being generated. It was being used up. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the accumulated stores of that original sensibility were drawn down by a production that had been built to run on it and was continuing to run, but with less and less of the original fuel available. A show's pilot is the most honest version of its promise. It is the show before success has changed the conditions of its production, before compromise has shaped its choices, before the specific pressures of long-running television have done their work on the things that began as instincts. The Family Guy pilot promises something specific and wonderful, and it delivers on that promise in the most complete way possible, by being, simply and fully, the show it promised to be. Section 19, The Promise Revisited at 3 in the morning. Somewhere around the third hour of watching old Family Guy episodes, the ones from the early seasons, there's a particular feeling that sets in. Not quite nostalgia, though nostalgia is part of it. Something more specific. The feeling of watching something that was made with genuine care by people who were paying attention to what they were making and who believed in it enough to protect it. You can feel that protection in the writing. You can feel it in the way the jokes are constructed, in the way the character moments are handled, in the way the endings are built to leave you with something rather than simply stopping. You can feel it in the animation, which in the early seasons had a looseness and an expressiveness that the later, more technically polished seasons often lacked. You can feel it in the specific rhythms of the dialogue, the specific way the characters talk to each other, the specific warmth that runs underneath even the darkest moments. The people who made those early episodes were not simply doing a job. They were making something they believed in, and that belief communicated itself through the screen in ways that are not easily explained, but are immediately recognizable to anyone who has spent time with creative work that was made with care versus creative work that was made without it. There is a question that this video has been circling without quite arriving at, which is the question of what the lesson is. What do you take from a story like this? From the story of a show that started beautifully and then made choices one by one that moved it away from that beginning, one answer is cautionary. The story of Family Guy can be read as a warning about what happens when commercial success outpaces creative care. When the business logic of keeping a profitable show running overrides the creative logic of keeping a good show good. When the pressure to produce content at volume erodes the standards that made the content worth producing in the first place. Another answer is more personal. The story of Family Guy can be read as a reminder of why the early seasons matter, of why we should pay attention to the things we love while they are at their best, of why the work of creative people who are fully present and fully engaged with what they are making is worth cherishing in the moment, rather than only in retrospect. A third answer, and maybe the most honest one, is that the story is not really about Family Guy at all, or not only about it, it is about the gap that opens in any long creative endeavor between the thing that was imagined and the thing that was made, between the promise and the delivery, between the pilot episode made in a kitchen by a 25-year-old with no sleep and no life and the product that bears the same name 25 years later, produced by a corporation, generating licensing revenue and streaming minutes, and the kind of continuity that is measured in spreadsheets rather than in the quality of the jokes. That gap is not unique to Family Guy. It is everywhere. It is in every sequel to a movie that did not need one. It is in every novel written under contract rather than under necessity. It is in every album recorded by a band and that has been together long enough to forget why they started. It is the universal story of creative things being required to keep existing after the conditions that made them vital have passed. What Family Guy adds to this universal story is the specific, pointed tragedy of how clearly those early seasons show what was possible. Most long running creative projects that decline do so from a lower baseline, from work that was always good rather than occasionally great. So the fall is smaller and the grief is quieter. Family Guy fell from a height that made the fall visible from a long distance. The early seasons were genuinely great in ways that the later seasons were not even trying to be. And that contrast is what makes the story of Family Guy's decline hurt in the specific way it does. For the people who loved the early show, the way early Family Guy deserved to be loved. But the early show is still there. You can still watch it. You can still have the experience of meeting those characters for the first time, of encountering a creative voice that was doing something it had never quite been done before, of watching a show be completely itself in the way that only the best things are completely themselves. That experience is not available for most of the later seasons, but it is preserved perfectly and permanently in the 7 episodes of season 1 and the 22 of seasons 2 and 3. Those 29 episodes are the complete statement of the promise. They are the show being everything it said it would be. They are, in the simplest possible sense, worth your time. And if you fall asleep to them tonight, if the voices of Peter and Brian and Stewie and Meg and Lois carry you somewhere quiet and restful, then the show will have done something for you that the later seasons, with all their noise and their excess and their restless search for the next thing to shock you with, were rarely capable of doing. The early show knew how to be still. It knew how to let a moment settle. It knew that a pause before a punchline is the difference between a good joke and a great one, and that a family in a living room at the end of a difficult day contains within it more genuine comedy and more genuine feeling than any amount of supplementary spectacle. That knowledge was the real promise. The promise that humor does not have to be loud to be funny. The characters do not have to be extreme to be interesting. That warmth and intelligence can coexist in the same room without one canceling the other out. That a story about a working class family in a fictional Rhode Island town, told with care and specific attention to the people involved, is a story worth telling. It was a good promise. Sleep well, end of script. Total word count, approximately 31,000 words. Section 20. The cost of the reset button. There is one specific creative habit that the later seasons of Family Guy developed that deserves its own dedicated examination, because it is perhaps the single clearest expression of the show's fundamental problem in its post peak years. It is the habit of resetting. Every episode of television operates with some version of a reset, because serialized continuity in a sitcom would eventually make the show impossible to produce and difficult to enter for new viewers. The Simpsons reset, Seinfeld reset, every sitcom resets. That is understood and accepted. The characters wake up the next week roughly where they were before, the world largely restored to its prior configuration. The lessons of the previous episode available for reference but not required for comprehension. What Family Guy developed was a different kind of reset. Not the standard sitcom reset where the world returns to its equilibrium after a plot disruption, but an active and aggressive reset, a show that would reach towards something meaningful and then, right at the moment when it might actually arrive somewhere, pull back and undo what it had done. Not because the plot required it, but because permanence apparently was something the show had decided to refute. The Seahorse Seashell Party is the most famous example. Meg stands up for herself. The family collapses. The show approaches an honest reckoning with what it has been doing to one of its characters for years. And then Meg takes it all back. The reset button is pressed. Everything returns to the status quo. The lesson is not learned. The damage is not repaired. The story ends not with resolution, but with re-imprisonment. But that episode is just the most visible example of a pattern that runs throughout the show's middle and late seasons. The Stewie Kills Lois two-parter, with its simulation twist that undoes everything, is a reset. The Life of Brian and Christmas Guy arc, which kills and then resurrects one of the show's most important characters within the space of 2 weeks, is a reset. The numerous episodes where Peter learns something about his relationship with Meg, or his relationship with his friends, or his own limitations as a father and a person, only to have forgotten all of it by the beginning of the next episode, are resets. The cost of these resets, accumulated over many seasons, is significant and specific. The cost is that the audience learns to stop caring. Not about the show entirely. People clearly continue to watch it, but about the stakes of any individual episode. If nothing that happens can stick, then nothing that happens matters. If the show can undo a character's death in 2 weeks, it cannot ask you to grieve that death. If every lesson that Peter learns is forgotten before the opening credits of the next episode, then the lesson is not a lesson. It is a decoration. This might seem like a harsh assessment of a comedy that never positioned itself as prestige drama. Family Guy was never The Wire. It was never asking its audience to invest in it, the way that audiences invest in the kind of television that commits to its consequences and sees them through. But the early seasons demonstrated that it was possible to have meaningful character moments within the context of a comedy without abandoning the comedy. The moments of genuine feeling in those first 3 seasons were not anomalies. They were part of the show's identity, part of what made the comedy land, because comedy that comes from characters you believe in hits differently than comedy that comes from cartoon characters with no interior lives. The reset habit killed that possibility. Once the show had established that nothing it did would stick, that every dramatic development was temporary and every character moment was isolated from every other character moment, the genuine feeling had nowhere to land. The moments where something real broke through, like the Quagmire speech about Brian, or the final confrontation in Seahorse Seashell Party, arrived in a context that the show had worked hard to make inhospitable to them. The audience wanted to respond to these moments, and the show immediately and efficiently told them not to bother. There is something almost self protective about this habit when you look at it from a certain angle. A show that commits to nothing cannot be accused of committing to the wrong thing. A show that undoes its dramatic developments cannot be held responsible for where those developments led. The reset is a way of generating the appearance of stakes without accepting the consequences of actual stakes. It is a way of having the emotional response without paying the price for it. But audiences feel this, even when they cannot articulate it. They feel the difference between a dramatic moment that is real, that will change something going forward. That means something beyond the 22 minutes it happens in, and a dramatic moment that is contained, that exists only for itself, that will be undone or forgotten by the time the next episode begins. They feel it in their willingness to invest, in the degree to which they allow themselves to care, in the specific quality of their engagement, whether it is the engaged and present kind or the half-watching kind. The ratings decline that the show experienced across its later seasons is measurable and documented. Season 4 averaged 7.9 million viewers. Season 13 averaged 5.86 million. Season 20 averaged 1.31 million. Season 23 averaged 723,000. These are not just numbers. They are a measurement of the distance between a show that had earned its audience's genuine investment and a show that had spent 20 years teaching that audience that investment was not required. The early show earned genuine investment. It earned it by making promises and keeping them, by creating characters who were real enough to care about, by telling stories that had actual stakes and actual consequences, by being, in the deepest sense, present. Present in its own world, fully committed to the specific people and situations it had invented, trusting those inventions enough to let them lead somewhere. The later show did not do these things consistently, and the audience, wisely and correctly, adjusted their investment accordingly. The show that plays it safe, that undoes its risks as quickly as it takes them, that never lets anything land long enough to require a genuine response, is a show that deserves a polite and distant relationship with its audience, rather than an invested one. The promise of Family Guy was a show worth caring about. The early seasons were worth caring about, they earned it. The later seasons spent years teaching the audience not to bother, and the audience eventually listened. Section 21. Gratitude. If you are still here, still listening as this video winds to its close, then you are the kind of person this channel exists for. The kind of person who finds something worth their time in the slow, quiet examination of things that once mattered, who is not in a hurry to get to the next thing, who is willing to spend a long night or an early morning sitting with a subject long enough to understand it. Family Guy is, in the end, a show about a family, a dysfunctional, loud, often ridiculous family in a made-up town by the ocean in New England, who love each other badly and imperfectly and sometimes with great tenderness. The love is the thing, it always was. The show was at its best when the love was legible, when you could feel it even through the case, when the jokes arrived carrying something warmer than just the desire to be funny. We talked tonight about every character and every promise and everything that was lost. And I want to end by saying something different, that the things that were kept are worth keeping too. That Road to Rhode Island is still one of the great episodes of American animated television. That the first time you watch Peter and Brian navigate any given disaster together in those early seasons, and you can see in both of them the specific quality of two people who have earned each other's trust through shared history, is still a pleasure that the later season's worst habits could not entirely erase. That Stewie Griffin, in his original form, was one of the great characters of his era, and that even in his softer later version, there are moments of genuine feeling that the early character could not have accessed. The promise that was made was real. The parts of it that were kept are worth more than all the parts that were broken. And the early seasons, those beautiful 7 and 22 episodes, are still exactly what they were. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. If you have been here with me through this whole video, a subscribe means everything. And a comment, wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is there, whatever brought you to this quiet hour and this long conversation, would make my night. Sleep well. Afterward. On watching something change. There is one more thing worth saying before the lights go fully down on this video, and it is something that goes a little beyond Family Guy specifically, into something broader about what it means to watch a creative thing age. We are all, in one way or another, people who have had the experience of loving something and then watching it change. Not just television shonen shows. Books that a favorite author wrote before they got too comfortable with their own success. Albums from bands who were hungry before they were famous. Films from directors who had everything to prove before they had everything to protect. The pattern repeats across every creative form. The early work has a quality, a particular aliveness, that the later work often lacks. The early work was made when the stakes were high and the constraints were real, and the need to communicate something was urgent enough to override the many small failures of nerve that accumulate in a person once they know they have already succeeded. Family Guy is an unusually clear example of this pattern because the early work is so good, and the later work is so specifically different and buckfont in its quality. Most examples of this pattern are less legible. Most of the time, the early and late work exist in a spectrum rather than in clear contrast. And you can argue about where the line falls and whether there even is a line. With Family Guy, the line is drawn in fairly unambiguous terms by the end of the third season, when the show was canceled the second time, and then returned with the energy redistributed in ways that were visible and real. But the deeper point, the point beneath the specific story of Family Guy is this. When you find something early, when you get to love it before it changes, you are getting something precious. The version of any creative work that exists before success has organized itself around the conditions of success is the purest version of that work. It is the version that was made primarily to communicate something rather than to protect something already built. The Family Guy pilot was made to communicate something. Those first 3 seasons were made to communicate something. What they communicated was a specific sensibility, a specific vision of what comedy could be, a specific set of characters who arrived fully formed and demanded to be known. That communication happened, loudly and clearly, and the 22 million people who tuned in on Super Bowl Sunday in 1999, and the millions more who found the show on Adult Swim and on DVD in the years that followed, received it. The communication became harder to sustain over time, for all the reasons we have covered in this video. But it never entirely stopped. Somewhere in every season of Family Guy, even the ones that were most clearly adrift from the show's original promise, there is a moment that sounds like the early show. A line reading, a character beat, a joke that arrives with the specific timing and the specific weight of something made by someone who remembered what the show was supposed to be. These moments are rare in the later seasons. They are common in the early ones. But they never disappear entirely. That endurance, the endurance of the original voice through decades of production that consistently pushed against it, is the final and perhaps most human thing about this story. A creative vision, once clearly expressed, is very hard to entirely eliminate. It leaves traces. It persists in the people who are formed by it, who carry it forward even as the conditions around them change. The early Family Guy still lives in Seth MacFarlane's voice performances, in every inflection of Peter and Brian and Stewie that recalls the version of those characters he built in his kitchen in 1998. It lives in the writing staff members who have been there since the early seasons, who know what the show was and carry that knowledge into the room every day they go to work on it. It lives in the audience and people like you who remember what was promised and keep the memory of it alive simply by caring about the difference between what the show was and what it became. That caring is not nothing. It is, in fact, a way of honoring the early work, of insisting that the promise was real and that it mattered, and that the people who made it should be held to a standard they once met, of saying clearly and without apology that the early seasons of Family Guy were genuinely great, and that great things deserve to be remembered as they were rather than only as what they became. So, here at the end, in whatever quiet hour finds you, that is what this entire video has been: a sustained act of remembering, of holding the early promise clearly in mind, of being honest about what was built and what was lost, and what, despite everything, remains. The show that debuted on January 31st, 1999 was something worth loving. It was. Good night.